The battle between good and evil was finally over today. Cities once full of people were in burning ruins. A calm, fulfilling life was finally and irreversibly lost, and mountains of dead bodies covered almost every patch of land. The victory over darkness ended in complete devastation and despondency. Still holding the spear with his hands in the enemy's body, Alan could not understand the reason. The motives of Clyde, who had caused the catastrophe of the world, remained a secret to him. Now the heavenly demon was no longer able to respond to any just reproaches. Suddenly, a familiar voice was heard behind the hero, forcing the guy to lower his hands. It was the goddess of the lyre named Vega, who considered it her duty to reward the winner. The patroness of weaving truly considered this catastrophe to be the salvation of the world. Unlike Alan himself, who was used to looking at things soberly, he lost everything. Vega's calm tone of voice outraged the hero to the utmost limit, and through tears he ordered the woman to shut up. Clyde turned out to be too strong. He managed to incinerate everything good, kind, and sensual and took it with him. It took only 10 years for this monster to develop. At this time, mysterious monsters appeared on Earth from portals that connected worlds. None of these beings were friendly. They wanted the destruction of humanity. When life on the planet became completely impossible and dangerous, everything began to change. Transcendental beings called Celestials began to appear among people. They had the power to fight monsters, backed up by their personal constellation. Thanks to the power of the planets and stars, the weight of the confrontation began to tilt in favor of humanity. For among the population of the planet, a generation of awakened ones gradually began to be born. These were the descendants of ordinary city dwellers who suddenly became the planet's hope for survival. But among the cohort of gifted people, no one noticed the birth of the heavenly demon, Clyde. This cunning youth had the power of the dark heavens, absorbing the stigmas of the gifted and even the powers of the Celestials. He quickly gained power and caused a new war. The whole world united against the villain. But tens of thousands of heroes died in this confrontation. They remained in their lives, and Clyde was given the opportunity to absorb the powers of the transcendental Celestials. At that moment, it seemed that this would be the end of earthly life. The heavenly demon was already celebrating his victory, rejoicing in the destruction of all living things. If it weren't for Alan's efforts, reality would have remained like this. Vega understood this perfectly well as the feeling of the hero, completely despairing of the justice of such an ending. But the reward was not to wait. The oath of the stars was a sacred duty. In exchange for saving the world, the goddess agreed to fulfill any wish of Alan. But I didn't expect his decision to return to the past at all. This was the first time she had encountered a person who wanted to regress. In Vega's opinion, this was the stupidest decision, because the future could become even more terrible. But the hero remained relentless. He believed that he was able to change everything. The young man could not come to terms with what he now saw around him, and no better solution came to mind. The goddess listened attentively to her interlocutor. Although their opinions did not coincide, she had no right to refuse. Finally, Alan asked for one more favor. This time he was more of a suggestion than an insistence. The hero sought to obtain the stigma of the lyre, and this was unprecedented progress. No human had been able to absorb the youth's powers until this moment. Not even such a terrible opponent. Therefore, Alan believed that he would be able to withstand the powerful divine load during rebirth. If the process is successful, he will have an additional powerful ace up his sleeve. Vega understood perfectly well that, to some extent, the hero was right, although the matter was extremely risky. She agreed to all the conditions of the interlocutor and promised to meet in the past, even though both of them will have no memory of what happened. But the stigma of the lyre will be clear evidence that Alan has regressed and will help with identification. An ordinary person from the first second of rebirth on Earth will be considered an apostle. All the awakened as one dreamed of such a level of power, but were never able to achieve it. When all the details were agreed upon and the preparations were completed, the hero tried to remember the enemy's face. The goddess moved on to fulfilling her oath, and Alan focused on finding Clyde before his becoming. The clock began to count down. It was an unrivaled spectacle. The hero's heart beat fast at the thought that the world he knew could escape grief. Now he had to correct all his mistakes. The system gradually informed Alan about the passage of each of the regression cycles, and when it came to assigning stigma, it was expected that problems would arise. Strange memories began to emerge from my consciousness, seeming completely real. The hero could not understand why the face of the stranger he now saw seemed so important. Consciousness and body continued to deteriorate in the process of transformation. Thoughts became confused. The situation was becoming increasingly unstable. The pain that shot through Alan from head to toe seemed impossible to bear. Moreover, the visions in my head made the sensations even more unpleasant. The voice, manner of communication, and appearance of the interlocutor immediately caused. He saw a black-haired guy standing next to him with a worried look on his face, which the hero himself had once broken. Consciousness couldn't keep up with the transformation of the body, but Alan was still able to recognize Clyde. The wave of anger further aggravated the situation with regression. The shell could not withstand excessive emotions. The hero did not understand how it could happen that they immediately found themselves next to each other. There was no need to look for the enemy. But it didn't matter. Alan understood, even felt, that the transition had been unsuccessful. He didn't get the one chance and didn't become the first of the chosen ones. The plan failed. Meanwhile, Clyde, standing next to his new acquaintance, could not understand why he died. It was a completely unfortunate moment because their lives were in danger, and the heavenly demon itself had not yet even developed its strength and did not have the ability to fight back. The monsters quickly surrounded the guy, who had no idea what to do. Hoping to salvage something from the corpse, Clyde decided to use the power of the dark skies. The future anti-hero had no idea what this could lead to. But he began to suspect something when he saw an unprecedented stigma on the chest of his new acquaintance. A few seconds after placing the palm, the system began to behave strangely. She announced the absorption of the stigma of the liar by the dark skies. This process turned out to be not only strange but also very painful. At some point, Clyde thought he couldn't handle the strain. Luckily, the absorption process ended before the guy went completely crazy. What's new? Now the anti-hero could see the system window, which was previously inaccessible to him. In addition, the same symbol as the deceased was imprinted on the chest of the absorber. Surprise quickly turned to fear when, unexpectedly, a goddess appeared opposite. Vega came at the call of her stigma and thoughtfully looked around. She knew she had never given such power to any person, so the conclusion was obvious. Before her now stood the hero, the savior of the world and the only bearer of the fateful constellation. She did not understand that this meeting was supposed to take place between her and the man lying next to her. To Clyde, the whole situation seemed like madness. He had no idea what a regressor meant and what responsibilities it placed on him. It seemed like it was the first time in his life that the guy had heard something like that directed at him. Usually, everything was much worse. Since childhood, in the orphanage, he was taught to deceive people, and not for his own benefit. The director thus wanted to cover up his own crimes without giving anything in return. But then he didn't yet know that he was approaching the wrong boy with this science. Just like that, even at a young age, Clyde was not going to allow anyone to profit from him. Of course, there were some brutal beatings in response to resistance. Anyone in power always tried to show the young man his place in this world. But the stubborn boy's answer always remained the same. Fortunately, since childhood he could rely on the reliable shoulder of his friend, she always came to the rescue. Elizabeth fought back where Clyde himself could not defend his boundaries. At 10 years old, the friend kept an aura of omnipotence in the eyes of the future heavenly demon. Then, only thanks to each other, the children survived on the edge. But the cruelty did not go without a trace. The bullying of his elders quickly forced Clyde to give in to his principles in exchange for his own life. When portals to other worlds opened on Earth and hell reigned, everywhere, select superhumans began to appear, thanks to whom existence could be significantly improved. The young scoundrel learned to deceive the gifted and did not feel any remorse for this. They perceived the guy as one of their own, and he, in turn, was in no hurry to convince them otherwise. Through the progress of others, he received rewards without making any effort. It got to the point that Clyde himself began to create combat squads in order to receive a greater fate. Today, the day began with another deception by a gifted man named Alan. Over the years of fraudulent schemes, the anti-hero learned to lie intricately and did not arouse suspicion at all. The conversation started very quickly, and the new acquaintances immediately found a common language. Citing fate, Clyde persuaded Alan to cooperate. The swindler always had an apt and convincing answer to any question the guy asked. He pretended to be a gifted but inexperienced warrior and sought to improve his skills. Each of the awakened had the stigma of some constellation, and their physical abilities depended on it. Therefore, to match Clyde, they even had to carve the constellation Aquarius, which is quite rare, onto his body. It was an ordinary scar, which, upon closer examination, could be distinguished from a real constellation. So he showed it pretty quickly and immediately moved on to choosing a dungeon. Today, together with Alan, they chose a low-ranking trip. Clyde didn't need any extra trouble. At first, he pretended to cast a protective spell on his companion. The process looked genuine because of a series of tricks the guy came up with. Usually the gifted believed in this theater as much as the gullible Alan. Feeling an unexpected surge of strength, the hero immediately rushed into battle with the first monsters. Once the matter was settled and the reward received, both guys had already agreed to go their separate ways. In this dungeon, the prize was myrrh crystals, which were capable of restoring the power of the constellation. For such a simple quest, it seemed like a real gift from fate. None of the interlocutors initially noticed the rapidly approaching danger. A minute later, they were surrounded by a whole gang of enraged Enthorns. It was obvious that even the two of them could not stand against such a number of monsters. The boys started running. Thoughts were jumping around in Clyde's head as if in a fever. He had never seen anything like this before. Nothing like this ever happened in low-ranking dungeons. In addition, these monsters were considered to be some of the fastest, so they had almost caught up with the fugitives. The situation was getting worse with every second. Alan glanced back at his fellow traveler here and there, as if expecting him to take active action. And when such behavior began to arouse the scoundrel's suspicions, the unpredictable happened. The gifted cap-eared man, who seemed like just a naive fool, kicked his companion in the face. He chose to sacrifice his new acquaintance for his own survival. It was a punch in the gut that Clyde had never expected to receive, which was usually what he did. The swindler fell to the ground and almost immediately heard an enraged growl behind him. Somewhere in the distance he heard Alan's justification, but it didn't matter anymore. His attention refocused on the guy only when he started glowing and screaming in pain. The scammer didn't understand what was happening. No one attacked his new acquaintance. When the stranger breathed his last, the thirst for life won out. Clyde was not going to die in these bushes. Now, the appearance of the goddess and all the events that had happened had sown confusion in the heart of the young man. He hoped that his status as a regressor and the deity nearby would help him deal with the Enthorns. At the same time, the bearer of the fateful constellation was a status that had extraordinary advantages in battle. All that remained was to figure out how to use the new abilities, if any. For the first time, Clyde succeeded in making a complete takeover, and he could not believe that fate had given him such a gifted warrior. The death of a real-time traveler radically changed the fate of the unfortunate orphan. A bunch of thoughts and memories swarmed in the swindler's head. He was so immersed in his feelings that he forgot about Vega's presence. But the goddess demanded an answer. She could punish for the treacherous theft. So Clyde immediately rose to his feet and without a twinge of conscience presented himself as a time traveler. This statement was met with thoughtful silence. After a few seconds, the woman pretended to believe the stranger's words. And he was already happy and relaxed, thinking that he had managed to deceive the goddess herself. But Vega wanted to test the bold statement in action. Clyde was in for a fight. About 100 monsters were now kept in place only thanks to the patroness of the Weavers. Since the goddess had never given such power to a man in her life, she sought to find out what he was like. The fateful star was not just a gift. The apostle had the power to deal with this flock with one wave of his hand. The monsters, perhaps sensing the reduction in restraining factors, began to growl at their prey. The sound made Clyde sweat with anxiety. He had never really fought any creature. Vega removed the containment field, and the Enthorns prepared for confrontation. The swindler, realizing that he was in real trouble, decided to play his role to the end. Apparently, after absorbing Alan's power, he felt significant changes inside, but he didn't know how to control it. So when the freaks rushed forward, he relied only on his instincts and agility. A scuffle ensued, during which neither creature was able to reach its victim. The goddess watched the boys' rapid movements but still seemed displeased. Clyde didn't understand this reaction because he was giving it his all. At least that's what it seemed to him. In the process, the fraudster began to enjoy it. He did not realize that this was a pleasant process. A pleasant bonus was the system's message about increasing spear mastery, which immediately disappeared into a whirlwind of memories that did not belong to Clyde. He saw Alan. I saw how a young man trains hard and applies technique after technique. Now the anti-hero used the same movements that he saw in his mind. It was unknown when those events took place, but the fighting style was a good clue. Even inexperienced, Clyde was able to grasp the level of skill that came with the absorption. In the entire history of his crimes, he had never seen a warrior like him. Unexpectedly, the goddess stopped the Chosen One halfway to his next opponent. It turns out that for some reason she decided that the guy was deliberately delaying the resolution of this confrontation. And this remark completely baffled Clyde. According to Vega, he still hasn't even thought about using the stigma. Although the swindler himself did not realize it, he considered such a surge of strength to be extraordinary. The patroness of the Weavers perceived the confusion in the guy's eyes with unexpected understanding. She realized that the regressor, due to time travel, did not understand how to use his skills. Seizing the opportunity to avoid exposure, Clyde readily agreed to the idea. In response, Vega agreed to help in this matter. A moment later, the woman gave the hero she considered to be her chosen one the blessings of the star. This allowed to increase the mastery of stigma. All around was illuminated by lightning, reaching up to the very sky. Clyde felt an insatiable thirst and the ability to destroy all enemies at once. And most importantly, now he felt on some intuitive level what needed to be done. Because of this unexpected change in behavior, the freaks also began to issue warnings. The electrical stimulation had done its job. The pain and rage had to find an outlet. Without even thinking, the young man used blue thunder against his enemies. A skill of only the first level turned the Enthorns into ashes. When the lightning bolt's effect ended, the swindler was finally able to catch his breath. He noticed that all of his opponents had disappeared only when the smoke from the attack cleared. The guy couldn't get his head around what he saw in front of him. In his life, he had never heard of the Lyra constellation, but now he had managed to feel a small part of its power. In addition to this, the young man finally realized who exactly was in front of him. The Lady of the Weaves was not the last deity in the pantheon, and not every warrior could boast of meeting her. Among the many constellations, there were several that bestowed very high rank and power. More precisely, there were 3 of them: Polaris, Deneb, and Vega. Moreover, Vega was considered the strongest of the 3, the most powerful goddess of this world. The fear of realizing his bad deed in the face of such power made Clyde freeze. He did not want to connect his life with the danger of destruction, so he even wanted to confess to what he had done. The strange behavior of the Chosen One again did not escape the watchful eye of the goddess. In the end, the swindler decided to play to the end. He was not one to give up halfway. The guy turned to Vega with the intention of embarrassing the woman with his familiarity. He took her hand in his and introduced himself solemnly. In fact, at that moment, he had no control at all over what came out of his mouth. Clyde's only hope was that he would be able to avoid reprisals and exposure through trickery. It really worked. Vega was now more interested in their relationship than the personality of the interlocutor. When the plan succeeded, butterflies of delight began to fly in the guy's stomach. A million questions from the patroness of the Weavers were drowned in the determination of mysterious refusals. The guy always answered the same thing: the future will put everything in its place. But the goddess did not consider this to be her order. She decided that the reason for the refusal to discuss it was her death. She, as always, told her version, and the young man completely agreed until he realized one thing. The talk was about the destruction of the world and the absorption of energies by the dark skies, that is, by himself. Vega insisted that the destruction of the heavenly demon was the key mission of the hero, the bearer of the fateful constellation. The whole paradox of the situation unexpectedly amused the swindler. With a smile on his face that could not be hidden, he promised that from today on the world would be safe. He insisted that he would protect all people, the chosen ones, and the gods, including the patroness of Tikal. Taking such solemn vows, the woman thought for a moment and became serious. She raised her hand and touched her interlocutor's forehead, announcing that from that moment on he would bless his path in the light of his star. Now the system has declared the guy an apostle. After resolving all the nuances, Vega's eyes were seen not far from Alan's body. In a voice that didn't even tremble with the lie, Clyde replied that he was a terrible thief. The guy insisted that his destruction was unavoidable. The goddess seemed satisfied with these explanations, but she still wanted to tell something important. Although the restriction did not allow this to be done, it was a sacred law that could not be broken. With her blessing, she touched upon the laws of the creation of the world, and from now on, she could not directly interfere with what was happening. Returning to her monastery, Vega persistently asked to come to her temple on Sunday. As the portal closed behind the goddess, Clyde fell to the ground, exhausted from the strain. He still couldn't believe what had happened to him. For the first time in his life, the benefits were greater than the losses. Looking at Alan's body, the guy thanked him again for the gift he had managed to receive. Although the regressor no longer cared, he finally knew peace. After such intense events, the upcoming heavenly demon decided not to return home empty-handed. Extreme life changes required special food. Guy decided to buy burgers at McDonald's. With the kind of earnings he had been making lately, he couldn't afford to build like that. But today I wanted to celebrate a special transformation with the person dearest to me. From the very doorway, Clyde loudly announced that he had returned home. Elizabeth, as usual, sat on the bed waiting for the guy. He had been her family for many years and brought a smile to her face in every way. But today, the circumstances of his arrival were different from what usually happened. That's why the girl wanted to know what exactly happened to Clyde. A casual conversation ensued, during which my friend attempted to make an unsuccessful joke about her health. The guy didn't like it. The very thought that something would happen to Elizabeth made him angry. To distract himself from the negativity, he took burgers out of the bag and put one in her hands. Due to an injury on one of the missions, the Superman lost his sight and his right leg, and henceforth depended on Clyde. It wasn't hard for him to take care of the girl because she had been doing it for many years since the shelter. Warm relations between them remained throughout the years. They considered each other family. Elizabeth realized that today was a special day by the taste of the food, which was different from the usual. It turned out that her taste buds weren't letting her down. A McDonald's burger was considered a restaurant dish. Clyde wasn't worried about money today, believing that starting tomorrow he would reach a new level of earnings. He wanted to please his girlfriend, rightly believing that she owed them both their lives. Of course, he never said it out loud because until now he had communicated with Elizabeth like a rude teenager, hiding sympathy and warm feelings behind insolence and insults. But the girl already understood their true level of closeness, because she judged her comrade's actions, not his words. Gradually, the dialogue touched on Clyde's transformation. At first, the guy didn't want to tell his girlfriend all the details of his deception. He briefly announced that he had finally become a Superman and that their financial situation would improve very soon. Elizabeth couldn't believe her ears. She had expected anything but such news. The dialogue between the friends continued until late at night, and only when it ended did the swindler have the opportunity to rest. It wasn't without details because the girl was interested in learning everything down to the smallest detail. The only thing Clyde continued to hide was that he had deceived Vega. The young man did not want Elizabeth to think bad things about him. The guy wanted to be a hero in her eyes. He decided to get acquainted with the system window of his abilities and was amazed by the gradation of dark forces. Dark skies were in almost every sentence, confirming the goddess's words about the destroyer of the world. The young man could not understand how it could happen that in the future he would destroy all living things. Now he did not strive for this at all. On the contrary, he wanted a good fate for himself and his adopted sister. After all, from now on, Clyde's main task became hiding the truth and self-control. Otherwise, he still didn't understand what needed to be done. The stigma of being a regressor placed great responsibilities on him, so he would be watched. A careful plan was needed to avoid the goddess's exposure and enhance the new skills. And to do this, it was necessary to take part in the cleansing of some dungeon by the end of the following Sunday. Having decided on his immediate future, the young man went home. To achieve productivity, it was necessary to get a good amount of sleep. A notification on his phone distracted his attention. It turned out that the invasion of the Enthorns was an anomalous situation caused by the appearance of mutants. These individuals got out of control and unwittingly changed the life of an orphan. This happened sometimes, but it still remained a big event in the information space. If he had remained a rookie without powers, Elizabeth would never have heard her comrade's voice in her life. Since the press advised against approaching this dungeon, Clyde decided to re-elect it. The next morning, the guy realized that he was not the only one who wanted to. Several heroes were gathering a team. The excitement among the warriors was caused by the reward of myrrh crystals. Just yesterday, he would have willingly agreed to all the proposals that were announced here. But today I preferred to explore the area on my own. Clyde moved slowly through the dark thickets, in no hurry. But after a few minutes, I saw the eyes of several Enthorns in the nearby bushes. They rushed at the potential victim without even thinking. Some individuals demonstrated remarkable intellectual abilities in attempting to surround the enemy. But it was all useless. Now the bearer of the liar stigma had a very fast reaction. He managed to dodge all the attacks, even from the most insidious. The Enthorns could only snap their teeth furiously and regroup, but not everyone managed to do this. For such behavior, yesterday's swindler demanded retribution, and immediately. He threw his opponents around like balls across the lawn. They had no chance of winning. A few seconds later, the first fight in the forest was over. Clyde was as happy as a child. He received so much power, an amount that he never expected to see. With one hand, he could throw the 80 kilograms of four-legged creature a great distance. After catching his breath, the young man began collecting crystals. The first catch was a pleasant bonus and a guarantee of a delicious dinner with Elizabeth. After taking the last reward, Clyde heard someone else approaching behind him. He believed that another group of Enthorns wanted to meet their death on the lawn. But it turned out that behind him was one of the real mutants. It was a real giant, surrounded by several ordinary individuals. And this monster did not like foreplay, so it immediately rushed forward. Clyde just licked his lips in tension. This fight was supposed to take him to the next level. The increasing danger only fueled the heavenly demon's curiosity. The boy knew that this was the perfect moment to test his stigma. The lightning bolt was activated within a second. It enveloped the spear that Clyde threw towards the enemy. He hit it very accurately, and the entire lawn lit up with a bright light. The hero himself was amazed by such skill. A single blow ended the duel. Silence reigned all around. No one dared to move. Looking around, Clyde saw several Enthorns nearby. They approached each other fearfully, not daring to attack. The fatal defeat of the mutant made it clear to the creatures that they should not mess with this man. Luckily for the guy, even this small victory allowed him to raise the Lyre constellation to the second level. Clyde had expected something like this, but he still hadn't expected such a great speed of progress. All that remained was to collect the spoils left after the fight. Suddenly, several more people came out onto the lawn, and the former swindler immediately understood their nature. The two men looked around and praised the accomplishments of the stranger. They were definitely marauding bandits, and they were watching what was happening the whole time. It was written all over their cunning faces. For the first time, Clyde's tactics were used against him. He calmly listened to everything that came out of their mouths. There was no point in rushing in self-defense. They scattered flattery around and slowly approached their potential victim. In order to win a favorable moment for yourself, it was necessary to act unexpectedly. In front of his hurt interlocutors, Clyde suddenly fell to his knees and began to apologize. The hero offered to take all his loot, but leave him alone and unharmed. The initial shock quickly passed, and the robbers stopped picking on him. They stopped seeing the ability to resist in their victim, and even turned their backs on the guy, which turned out to be a fatal mistake, because the young man's blade almost immediately pierced one of the villains. Clyde was smiling predatorily at this time. He was not someone who could be robbed with impunity. The second robber froze in place and began to make terrifying noises. But then he took up arms, because he realized that he would not leave this clearing without a confrontation. A quick scuffle ensued, during which it quickly became obvious that the former swindler was much faster than his opponent, and Clyde himself only enjoyed the process. It seemed that there was no simpler confrontation in his life. Thanks to the constellation, a quick denouement came. When the last robber was dealt with, the young man only sighed with relief. Now it was possible to move further, deeper into the dungeon. But first, it was possible to profit from the bodies of the robbers thanks to the power of the dark skies. Although it was risky, given the impending disaster, it raised many doubts, especially in the context of a possible revelation by the goddess Vega. Clyde decided to take a risk and touch the dead men one by one. By absorbing the powers of both scumbags, the Dark Heaven's rank was raised. It turned out to be quite a painful process, the former swindler gritting his teeth from the strain. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't hold back the scream. As the process reached its peak, the merging of the Lyra constellation and the dark skies awakened Alan's memories. Clyde saw the young man in a hospital room next to a tall man in a robe. It was the autumn of 2020. It turned out that for some reason the time traveler lost consciousness for 2 Sundays. And judging by the conversation between these two, they were very close friends. Alan had suffered on his own initiative and was now apologizing. The danger had indeed been serious. The interlocutor had nothing to add in response. Complete silence reigned in the room, which was interrupted by the arrival of a stern-looking girl. She turned to the brunette as her leader and reported the latest news about the discovery of the relic. It turns out that she was located just behind the gate through which Alan passed. The three were unable to catch anything else from the conversation, because the memories began to dissolve. The time traveler's immersion in his memories was unpleasant and completely uninformative for Clyde. Enlightenment was achieved, and at the same time, the mastery of weapons also increased significantly. The fraudster hoped that the visions would subsequently become more coherent and allow him to understand what had happened. Sacred relics were very powerful artifacts that increased strength by several levels. Luckily, he heard the name of the gate to the dungeon where she was to be found in 8 days. One could try to take possession of this object and experience its power on oneself. These things could not be overlooked during the process of self-improvement. Having earned enough crystals in this mission, the boy went to the Hero Association Bank. There were, as usual, many people there. After calmly waiting for his turn, he heard the cost of his catch and the income tax. For the first time, the guy wanted to do everything honestly and was shocked by the state's extortion. 20% was to be paid by all people who made excessive profits. But there was nothing to be done. Refusal could also cause problems with the law. In order to get the money, you had to sit in another line, called by numbers. Finally, it came to Clyde, who was almost asleep sitting in a chair. To log in, he had to name his constellation, and the guy calmly complied with the worker's request. The word lira caused a stir as expected. At first, the interlocutor did not believe what she heard. She had little control over her emotions, unlike the client, who remained unperturbed. Clyde clearly and confidently dictated the name of the constellation letter by letter, so that there would be no more doubts. After that, the speed of service reached a completely new level. The attitude also changed instantly. The manager said that the young man should move to the VIP room. With the stigma of the liar, nothing else could be expected, although Clyde preferred to remain in the shadows as much as possible. So the former swindler resigned himself to the idea that this is how his life would now look. The VIP room turned out to be quite cozy, despite its large size. To top it all off, there was already some arrogant blonde guy sitting there. It was clear at first glance. He was used to behaving insolently and condescendingly. Clyde just silently studied his neighbor. He wasn't used to revealing all his cards right away. Finally, deciding that he did not want any more conflicts, the young man turned his attention to the food on the table. There was nothing there but real exclusive snacks that were simply impossible to refuse. Only after looking at such a variety did Clyde realize that he had never actually held a grain in his mouth. Unable to restrain himself any longer, the boy began to greedily devour the bank's gifts. Despite his neighbor's disapproving gaze, the swindler had long since ceased to depend on anyone else's opinion except Elizabeth's. Hunger was tired and it was time to think about a friend. She would not refuse to try something tasty. Clyde's thoughts and dreams were interrupted by the voice of a stranger. The blonde had never seen such hungry celebrities in the VIP room. And I could not remain silent and not express my contempt for this matter out loud. The hero calmly swallowed the last portion of food and cheekily remarked that his opponent had a long tongue. When Clyde looked up at his interlocutor, he saw his absolute copy in front of him. But, of course, the blonde didn't understand this. He only became more angry. The fraudster continued to hold the bar. He remembered the manager's reaction and wanted to reinforce it. Therefore, I added as much weight to my personality as possible without going into details. And he emphasized that everyone already knew him, except for his neighbor in the VIP room, who seemed to have lost his memory. The last clarification replaced the blonde's anger with anxiety and warning. For, judging by the behavior of the interlocutor, he really was an important person. It was necessary to be friends with such people and not to quarrel with them or to consider them enemies. The guy started going through all the possible options of celebrities and legendary warriors in his head. He was not attached to age because he knew that upon acquiring the 9th star, the carrier's body could rejuvenate. The special attitude of the bank employees towards this man also indicated his exceptionalism. In the end, all the thoughts in the neighbor's head formed the behavior and excuse of his own ego. Clyde was pleased with his inventive and provocative effect, but he couldn't stop playing out his scam, further increasing the interlocutor's fear. The blonde jumped up from his seat, bowed politely, introduced himself as Brian, and apologized again for his behavior. It turned out that the neighbor was a member of the Imperial Scorpion Guild, which was one of the top guilds in the country. It is obvious that all the people of Korea knew very well who was her head. Clyde decided to continue lying and noted that he was friends with their leader personally. This increased the level of respect for the guy in Brian's eyes. So in the end, the swindler decided to send his regards to the head of the Imperial Scorpion Guild. He even gave his own name, hoping that the man would not attach much importance to it. Meanwhile, the blonde reached a new level of sycophancy and once again apologized for his boorish behavior. Clyde's response was a wide grin. It was the easiest lie he had ever pulled in his life. The hero decided to imitate a light image and offered to work off the unworthy act. Brian immediately agreed to all the conditions, even before hearing them. And just a few minutes later, a large portion of food ordered from the restaurant was on the table in front of the crook. Clyde did not do this for himself. He hoped to please Elizabeth in this way. Having done what was required of him, the blonde said that he was going home. From that moment on, he was not interested in the affairs of the bank. Brian was so nervous that he could not find a place for himself. The unfortunate, arrogant major left the room, bowing to Clyde until the very end. From that moment on, the VIP apartments were ruled by one owner. The mood improved even more when the swindler pulled out his interlocutor's wallet from under his buttock. He could not resist such a temptation and cleaned the impudent fellow to the last thread. But delight quickly turned to surprise when Clyde saw a find at the bottom of one of his pockets. There lay a myrrh crystal, obtained by destroying a mutant. These creatures themselves were rare, not to mention the rewards for them. The precious guest's reflections were interrupted by the appearance of the manager. The man stood in the doorway and looked at the client. His name was Ben, and it turned out that this man was the leader of the emergency response team. The acquaintance ended with a firm handshake. It was time to get down to business. Thanks to the power of the dark skies, Clyde soberly assessed that before him was an interlocutor of the greatest power. This was also confirmed verbally. The 6 stars of the Taurus constellation were a genuine achievement in the world of heroes. It was the turn of the fraudster himself to answer uncomfortable questions about his own capabilities. The institution needed to check the newcomer's claim about the stigmatic constellation of the liar as thoroughly as possible. No one trusted the word of the first person they came across in such matters. Confirmation was needed, especially since this had never happened in the human world. Clyde calmly showed his mark on his chest. The interlocutor began to look at her thoughtfully. Finally, after a few seconds of silence, he offered to take the exam in his services. It was a personal, private test. Of course, Clyde had no option to refuse without arousing suspicion. 15 minutes later, the future opponents found themselves in the training hall. The instructor insisted that the candidate had to use real weapons during the fight. From the heavenly demon's perspective, this was overconfidence, but he didn't object. On the contrary, he was interested in what might happen during such a confrontation. Between them was a 4-star experience. There had to be a major upgrade or a quick loss. Clyde decided not to waste time and was the first to rush into the attack. Ben took a defensive stance, armed only with boxing gloves. A second later, the stigma of the heavenly demon was activated, and the entire hall was filled with blue light. The instructor's eyes had never seen such a sight in his life. The 2-star candidate seemed much stronger than expected, perhaps stronger than Ben. And with each blow, the boy increased his pressure even more. Therefore, urgent measures had to be taken to stay in place. Clyde was thrown about 20 meters and hit his back against the wall. Seeing that his opponent had stopped and caught his breath, the manager was afraid that he had gone a little overboard with the counterattack. But unexpectedly, the heavenly demon said that he was ready to continue the fight. For the guy, everything that was happening was perceived as a challenge, a wall that he had to break through. Ben didn't object, but rather prepared for the second round. Once again, the candidate was the first to attack, and this time the activation of the stigma was even faster. The instructor did not dodge in response, but adopted the tactic of blocking possible blows. This could be used to one's advantage. At the right moment, Clyde made a feint, and he himself rushed in the other direction to catch the enemy by surprise. During the maneuver, the swindler felt the stigma level increase. The lightning skill reached the 2nd level. The next blow was like an attack from a completely new person, and at least twice as strong. It was strange for Ben to test an opponent who was improving his skills with every passing second. Clyde himself also felt that he couldn't stop now. He could achieve an even greater upgrade. Both opponents gradually began to forget that this was an ordinary test and not a real battle. The manager became increasingly involved in the confrontation, moving towards more active actions. And at some point, he even managed to hit the candidate in the face. This outburst stopped the testing in an unexpected way. Clyde again flew a great distance away from his opponent and fell to the floor unconscious. Ben immediately rushed to him, calling for medics at the same time. The healing elixir helped the young man quickly get back on his feet. Fortunately, there were no serious injuries and none of the men had to worry about the consequences. Naturally, no expenses were asked from the hero. All responsibility was placed on the manager. He paid for a very expensive potion out of his own pocket. But Clyde insisted not to worry. He was pleased that his opponent had used his stigma to win. This meant that his own strength and skills were truly difficult to overcome, even for the experienced. Meanwhile, Ben himself could not stop looking at the genuine, only apostle of the goddess Vega in the world. He could not miss the chance to have a personal conversation with such an outstanding person. That's why I asked about it directly, which led my interlocutor into a dead end. Clyde didn't know how to react or what awaited him. It turned out that the manager wanted to offer the young man admission to his guild. He talked about all the advantages of such a solution, while the fraudster himself reasoned about the consequences. The heavenly demon rightly believed that with the rapid development of his skills, he could receive better offers. He didn't want to limit himself to any boundaries now, so he politely declined the invitation. But Ben went to extreme lengths to persuade the candidate to agree, even offering not to work at all. Getting paid to do nothing was a really good deal. So Clyde decided to listen to his interlocutor a little longer, finding out more details. Even nominal participation of a liar stigma bearer in a guild will give it greater significance. Ben believes that such an alliance would benefit both parties with minimal commitment. The newly minted hero, accustomed to getting money without effort, was truly interested. He believed that he had won a real lottery, and that Elizabeth would thus have a secure life. But you couldn't show the manager your immediate consent. You had to maintain your reputation. Clyde decided that from that moment on he would radically change his existence. He will become the master of the world, at least his small one. The decisive factor was that membership in the guild exempts one from mandatory taxation. The young man still could not forget these 20% reimbursed to the state. Therefore, after just a moment he gave his consent to fruitful cooperation, and this day ended better than he expected. The guy went home full of hope for a bright future. A better life was already on the horizon, but it was overshadowed by possible exposure. Clyde remembered Vega's wishes to meet on Sunday, which was already drawing to a close. He was very nervous, but he could not avoid carrying out the goddess's orders. His legs themselves led him to the sanctuary of the patroness of weaving. There were many people there. The parishioners conscientiously prayed for the attention of the deity and his mercy. It was within Vega's power to make a person become one of the awakened and change his life. In essence, he was walking proof of this theory. Gathering his courage, the young man crossed the gate that connected the two worlds. A few seconds later, Clyde's eyes opened to the goddess's sanctuary. It was an extremely grandiose spectacle, previously inaccessible to the guy. He wanted to remember this beauty that surrounded him forever. But there was no time to waste. The main task was to find the owner of this place. It took the guy some time to find it, but the meeting finally took place. Vega was surprisingly serious. It seemed like she had learned the truth. Clyde's heart was gripped by a sticky feeling of dread. But having overcome his anxiety, the young man masterfully began to pretend to be kind and loving. This manner of communication again confused the woman. To completely distract his attention, the guy immediately began to apologize for his behavior. The goddess began to insist that the past should be left where it belongs. The memories, no matter how beautiful they were, did not correspond to reality now. And although Vega said that she didn't like flattery, it looked the other way around. Finally, the dialogue moved to a more pressing topic. The patroness of the weavers noticed that while they had not seen each other, the guy had upgraded himself. This was appropriate, given the details of the catastrophic future that must now be discussed. The goddess insisted on her right to know the details in order to help, but Clyde did not know them. Therefore, we had to rely on general phrases about the heavenly demon. The guy had a hard time talking about his essence because no one knew it better than him. This turned out to be valuable information that made the patroness of the weavers think. The fraudster insisted that until the last moment no one had guessed the true identity of the enemy. And such a statement aroused suspicion in the interlocutor because a regressor stood in front of her. And this meant that in the future he had already fought and destroyed his opponent. That is why he was endowed with such extraordinary power, which Clyde of course did not suspect. The goddess's remark made him afraid. The guy had just learned of his death and didn't understand why Alan had returned to the past. This information meant that in order to avoid suspicions of legitimacy, it was necessary to create a credible legend. The fraudster cited the ardor of battle and the complete destruction of the opponent without the possibility of identification. It was as if he had dissolved into thin air, literally into molecules, so Vega could not deny such reality. Now, at this time, in order to search for the heavenly demon, Clyde suggested simply waiting. Having calculated everything ahead of time, the young man assured that the awakening of the enemy would occur in 3 years. During this pause, it was possible to properly prepare for the meeting and increase your rank. He informed Vega of his urgent plans to visit the dungeon with a rare artifact. The only memories Alan had were meant to play into the hands of the Tikal patroness's conviction. Having listened to everything that her interlocutor shared with her, the goddess sighed heavily. She saw that the apostle had already appreciated all the advantages of the regressor. Clyde didn't even have time to be surprised. And the woman had already violated his personal space and hugged him like a close person. She really cared about the hero and didn't want him to be overwhelmed. Such unheard-of kindness on Vega's part instantly disarmed the swindler, and he began to reproach himself for lying. But the instinct of self-preservation still prevailed. Clyde began to assure the teacher that he was ready to face any challenges for her sake. The woman responded by shyly covering her face with her hands. It was clear that the goddess was pleased to hear such things. Having achieved the desired effect, the heavenly demon decided to quickly say goodbye. But things didn't turn out as expected. The patroness of the weavers had her own plans for the future. The woman announced her desire to accompany her apostle. Moreover, she wanted to create an earthly shell for herself so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicion among people. This turn of events was not at all part of the guy's plans. So Clyde began to try to dissuade his interlocutor from her idea. But it was all in vain. The goddess wanted to take this step, even having lost all the fullness of her power. The swindler was in despair. and now his position was becoming even more precarious. Gradually, Vega began to change, increasingly resembling a miniature copy of a human. She gave her apostle a pendant which he was to wear, so that she would maintain her altered appearance. The motivation of the patroness of the weave was to help Clyde for his efforts. She didn't want him to wander the earth alone for 3 years looking for trouble. This revelation brought the boy to tears. His desired peaceful life will now remain in his imagination. An hour later, the guy and his company went home, where Elizabeth had been waiting for him for a long time. The friend lost self-control after the narration of events. She could not believe in Vega's presence. What especially irritated her was that now she and Clyde could not be alone. It was time for dinner and the guy took out all the food he had managed to shoot during the day. The McDonald's burger delighted not only Elizabeth, but also the goddess. She had never tried human food before and was very pleased. The blind gifted girl was interested in the reasons why Vega chose Clyde, but she calmly replied that it would have been impossible to find a more suitable candidate anywhere in the world. The patroness of the Weavers, without hiding anything, declared that the young man was destined to become the greatest warrior. Elizabeth did not deny it out loud, although she immediately thought of her comrade's fraudulent past. But when she heard that they considered her special, she forgot about her previous opinions. Clyde didn't ask anything. He just silently listened to the dialogue between the two women. As it turned out, having a goddess in the house was very beneficial. The patroness of the Weavers could make a girl regain her lost sight. But this had to be done not today. At least that's what the supernatural creature assured. After a good, nutritious dinner, Vega felt tired and tried to rest. Having said goodbye to the owners of the house, she promised to visit them tomorrow. When the visitor disappeared into the portal, the stunned comrades could not understand what had happened. The vision healing story seemed too good to be true. But Elizabeth was not one to dwell on anything, so she chose a more pleasant topic of conversation. The girl wanted support more than anything else now, so she asked to lie on Clyde's lap. This tradition was maintained by them for many years, as well as the rude comments from the guy who couldn't even think of refusing his girlfriend's request. The peculiar manner of communication ultimately suited both of them. They understood that it was all a joke. Soon, Elizabeth announced that she was going to sleep in this position. Clyde was happy with this state of affairs. It had been a long time since friends had had such close contact, and it was nice after a busy day. The 2 days before the opening of the dungeon passed quietly. The guy was at home. Vega joined the test. She was interested in accompanying her apostle. From the goddess's behavior, it became clear that she completely relied on Clyde and trusted him. This flattered the heavenly demon, but the urgent task was to subdue this strange dungeon and obtain the artifact. For this purpose, the guy made reserves of valuable Zil, but was thinking about absorbing the constellation Aquarius. The abilities of this stigma made it possible to prepare tinctures on one's own and even sell them to others. The guy didn't immediately hear the enemy approaching, but his quick reaction came in handy. It was one of the giant tentacles that was trying to grab him from behind. Looking back, the hero saw a small creature that had probably been following them for some time. Under the goddess's watch, he could not ignore any of the dangers, so he decided to attack. He rushed back with the intention of killing his pursuer. But halfway there, he was met by a powerful explosion, and the creature seemed to resort to self-destruction. The hideous monster left behind even more vile remains. For the goddess, this situation also seemed rather strange, especially when each of the monster's particles turned into an independent organism. Strengthened by some magical power, they rushed together at the dungeon conqueror. This was aggravated by the fact that any careless movements could provoke a new explosion. Since he had to act carefully, Clyde decided to use the good old method, a classic brawl, but with some peculiarities. For example, it was a good idea to use the long-range combat skill. The goddess, in turn, did not give any advice, but simply watched the apostle. The lightning spear hit a real crowd of monsters, but along the way, he eliminated those who were at some distance. The heavenly demon's joy knew no bounds. His idea had succeeded. Moreover, the stigma technique was used for the first time without the use of Vega's blessing. The patroness was amazed. Since their last meeting, Clyde had managed to improve his abilities well. She sincerely praised the apostle for his progress, but she promised that later she would work with him to master all the subtleties of the liar stigma. This played into the hands of the swindler, who had no idea what else this constellation might hide within itself. He explained this to his interlocutor as a strange feeling of confusion upon his return. But in the goddess's experience, regression had never led to amnesia, so this was suspicious. To correct this impression, Clyde presented several hypothetical arguments in his favor, and these thoughts, nevertheless, found a response in Vega's consciousness. They had a basis for existence. To consolidate the result, the swindler got back on his favorite horse. While the riddles about the possible sympathy between them in the past worked, it was necessary to use them. But today, such behavior of the apostle only irritated the goddess. She insisted that such topics should be completely excluded from their communication in the future. The conversation had to be interrupted due to the space being filled with ominous energy. The patroness of the weaver felt this and immediately informed her ward. On the floor, the young man saw one of the black myrrh crystals from the mutant. This was the second time he had encountered such an object in places where it shouldn't have been. In this dungeon, they lay right under your feet and could be collected without participating in battles. Standing still was not an option, so after a short meeting, Clyde decided to move forward. What was happening now had never happened before in the entire existence of Vega. On the way, they did not meet a single enemy, but the feeling of danger did not leave the patroness of the weavers. The landscape seemed uniform, as if they were wandering in circles and the goddess noticed it. An unexpected salvation in the situation was an unpleasant smell in one of the tunnels. The swindler immediately seized on this nuance and suggested exploring this passage. With every step, the stench became more and more unbearable. But this is not a reason to stop. Quite the opposite. Especially after Vega's assurances that the feeling of ominous energy only grew stronger. The passage gradually grew into something like a hall with a huge stone figure in the middle. There was some kind of star shining near the figure's forehead. On closer inspection, it turned out that they were looking at a relic. The swindler began making plans to sell the artifact, and he spent almost no effort to obtain it. Clyde's eyes were shining with money and he didn't pay attention to anything else. Vega managed to ask several times if this was really the thing they came here for. Having confirmed the information, the hero decided to immediately take the mug and leave. But almost at the same moment, a familiar sound was heard behind the guy. These were the same creatures as the previous time. As it turned out, they were the guards of the relic, and the number of monsters was astonishing. Clyde wasn't afraid of another fight. His only desire was to speed it up. But this dungeon could still surprise. The green creatures united into a giant monster. The gigantic dimensions made the young man doubt his abilities. The monster loomed over its enemy, ready to fight. Upon closer inspection, it seemed that this was a non-trivial opponent. The goddess watched the guy's reaction, but interpreted it incorrectly. Such a meeting was unexpected. She decided not to interfere, but just to watch from the sidelines. Clyde, in turn, could not lose face in the eyes of his patroness, so he agreed with everything. The guy simply had no choice. He had to make do with what he had. To be honest, the swindler didn't even know how to approach the monster. For the first time in his life, he encountered such a gigantic killing machine. In addition to this, the young man still did not know any stigma technique other than lightning. But he hoped that during this fight, he would be able to discover new interesting facts about his strength. The green, ugly monsters couldn't have become armored in an instant. They had to have weak spots. Suddenly, Clyde remembered the gun he had brought with him in his bag and took it out. Without any extra thoughts in his head, the guy fired a bullet towards the enemy. The unconventional approach threw both opponents off track. Obviously, such an attack looked like a shot to an elephant. But the shot was a good distraction that needed to be used to advantage. Clyde quickly grabbed the spear and ran forward. By jumping into the air, he hoped to hit his opponent in the head or at least in the neck. The swindler hoped to solve everything with one attack by increasing his energy power. The spear was stuck in the green giant's back, and the cave was illuminated by a bright flash of lightning. The monster growled angrily but did not return to its attacker. Clyde gritted his teeth, realizing that something unpredictable was happening now. And indeed, the enemy released several tentacles, trying to grab the guy and take revenge on him. One attack was not enough in this fight. The situation was getting worse. The swindler maneuvered as skillfully as his abilities allowed, but the giant could grow new limbs at the speed of light. If it weren't for the guy's cunning, he would have fallen into the trap long ago. Clyde hopes this bastard didn't have any extra cards up his sleeve, because otherwise he might not be so lucky next time. At some point, the sky demon was able to turn around and jump on the monster from above. There was not a second to lose, so Stigma was brought into play once again. Lightning struck the monster right in the face, and it growled in rage in response. What made it even more difficult was that, with each blow, Clyde was gradually losing control due to the force. But, to the guy's great surprise, he still managed to knock the monster to the ground. The swindler barely managed to avoid being crushed, and it seemed that the green giant lost consciousness. And this greatly amused Clyde. He became so distracted that he lost his vigilance. Confidence in one's own power became stronger and stronger. Vega's scream, which had always remained silent, immediately awakened tension throughout his entire body. But it was too late. One of the monster's tentacles hit the young man in the chest. The attack was very strong and the hero disappeared in a column of ash and pieces of stone. The goddess immediately flew closer to assess the extent of the damage and help if necessary. But danger still threatened both of them. The monster had woken up and was ready to continue. Since there was no more strength left in the rogue's body, he decided to ask the patroness for help. She had to give one more blessing to support the youth's vitality. After briefly considering this request, Vega agreed. And indeed, the boost seemed to breathe a second life into Clyde. The level of mastery of stigma, together with tenacity, has increased significantly. In just a moment, the guy was flying towards the enemy with the aim of destroying him. He, in turn, dragged many tentacles towards the guy. Clyde masterfully dodged all the obstacles just like last time. But very soon, he got tired of doing this. It was time to fight back. With the help of the stigma of the liar, the young man repelled the monster's attacks with one counterattack. Once that was done, it was time to strike the mutant's body itself. Blow after blow rained down, but at the same time the amount of mana in the hero's body decreased. But Clyde didn't think it mattered. At that moment, he felt a power without limits inside himself. Yesterday's swindler rushed into battle with renewed vigor, leaving his opponent no chance to maneuver. With his whole being, the heavenly demon felt that the duel was nearing its end. Some explosive feeling continued to brew inside. The guy came to his senses only when he heard the voice of the goddess. She ordered him to stop because in reality the victory had already been won. Clyde felt confused. He realized that he had lost control of his consciousness for a few seconds. A feeling of pain, unbearable pain in the chest, cut through my thoughts. The goddess immediately reacted as if she knew what was being discussed. Lifting his shirt up, the young man saw that his stigma had begun to change. The hero's indicators were increasing. As evidenced by the system notifications, he reached the 3rd star. This growth took him less than a month. Moreover, Vega was amazed that this was how the most complex stigma in the world developed. From what the goddess saw, it turned out that this young man was not as simple as she initially thought. Clyde finally lost consciousness from the unbearable pain. And no matter what efforts the patroness of weaving made, it was all in vain. The overvoltage was given in signs. The swindler didn't know how much time had passed before he opened his eyes. At first, the guy even thought he was dreaming. But it was really Vega who was very concerned about his well-being. During the time that consciousness was absent, the goddess managed to take on a form that was adaptive to humans. It was surprising, considering what she had said in the shrine about limiting her own powers. The young man wanted to get up immediately, but she insisted on remaining calm. It was necessary to make sure that Clyde had finally regained his health. Thinking out loud to the goddess gave the swindler a strange feeling, as if he were talking to his mother. The guy wasn't going to argue with her, especially when I saw that the woman was behaving strangely. Every time this happened, the heavenly demon suspected that he had been exposed. But this time, the goddess was embarrassed that the apostle called her by name. According to her, it could not be called a bad act. Since she allowed even Elizabeth to address her in this way, Clyde could do the same. But it made her think about their past relationship. Because of which the scammer immediately had to reconsider the situation with flirting in relation to personal matters. He no longer wanted to address his mentor in an informal manner. But Vega immediately stopped his powers and returned the situation to its usual circle. Suddenly, the laws of the world once again applied their restrictions to the patroness of weaving. Fortunately, this happened now, and not when the young man was unconscious. Clyde felt guilty about this because he had forced the goddess to break the rules again. Vega was not against any restrictions if her apostle thus reached the 3rd star. Looking down, the swindler saw all the stock of bottles with healing potions. They were completely empty. This could only mean one thing. The goddess was not healing him on her own. She herself confirmed this with the sincere spontaneity of a child, not knowing about the preciousness of the things. This peculiar confession brought the heavenly demon to tears. It turned out that this dungeon is the most expensive in the hero's career, at least to date. The young man demanded details, but the goddess avoided this conversation. It is unclear for what reasons she did not even want to tell how she poured the potion. Without saying a proper goodbye, Vega disappeared into the glow of the portal, leaving Clyde alone with his thoughts. The guy immediately frowned. He didn't like secrets, but now it was important to get the relic, the reason why he was in the dungeon. Even at the mention of the possible monetary gain, a smile appeared on Clyde's face. The guy pulled the cup from the statue's forehead quite deftly. Now he was interested in the possibilities of this little thing. The swindler hoped that the relic also had several stars, and that he had not suffered such torment in vain. The heavenly demon was amazed when the cup in his hands became active. Something was definitely happening, but he couldn't tell if it was good or bad. Suddenly, the system reported the absorption of the sacred relic's energy. The dark skies showed themselves in an unexpected light here too. This evil force sought to develop and used every opportunity to do so. This was the first time this had happened to Clyde in relation to the word. Before, he had only robbed people. If the relic's power had been absorbed, it was now completely useless. This development of events did not fit into the fraudster's pre-planned plan. He couldn't make any money from this dungeon, and in fact he lost a large sum. Today, Elizabeth's life already has many chances to change for the better. The hysteria was stopped by the appearance of strangers. There were several people who hid their identities behind deep hoods. They looked at the hero in silence, not moving from their places. Suddenly, one of the strangers laughed. He also did not expect to see the conqueror here. This group was going to carry off the relic incognito and had no intention of giving it up now. Clyde didn't want to fight, so he simply offered to buy the thing from him. He argued in favor of this idea, insisting that he did not need the cup. And in conclusion, he played the card of an inexperienced warrior. Silence reigned in the cave. What unexpectedly cut through the laughter of the group leader, he assured that they did not intend to threaten. And although Clyde laughed in response, he knew perfectly well that it was a lie. The young man had been a robber too long to recognize the same kind of people. The danger had not gone away. It was necessary to remain on guard. The guy was confronted by real murderers posing as innocent heroes. Most likely, a conflict with these people cannot be avoided. But, fortunately, the interlocutors turned out to be simpler than they seemed at first glance. They agreed to the deal and gave a giant mirror crystal for the cup. Of course, this exchange left the guy delighted, although on the outside he tried to keep a straight face. The agreement was made, and Clyde walked towards the exit, pretending that he was not at all interested in what would happen next. But in reality, the young man had no intention of leaving this dungeon without finding out the stranger's purpose. He hid behind one of the performances to eavesdrop on their conversation. And, as it turned out, he did it for a reason. The arrival of this company indicated that they knew about the relic. Because from Alan's memories, he clearly remembered that the cup would only be found in 6 days. This suggested that the future could be changed by the actions of the fraudster himself. The first thing Clyde learned was the reason why he was not eliminated immediately. The strange sectarians simply did not want to attract unnecessary public attention to themselves. This didn't mean the guy would be left alone. The leader looked at the relic in his hands with pleasure. Luckily, he didn't realize he was holding a regular dish. The blonde was screaming about the dominance of the dark stars. His subordinates threw themselves on the floor immediately after these words and began to pray. Clyde realized that the Dark Stars were the name of an organization of cultists. The strangers came to this dungeon to replace the relic with a fake one, not just take it. The scoundrels did all this very quickly. When the matter was completed, the leader ordered to open the portal and return home. But as he was saying goodbye, he couldn't resist giving an order. It was still necessary to resolve the issue with the young man who sold them the cup. The blonde ordered one of his men to kill Clyde, and they could not refuse this task. The heavenly demon was pleased with his own intelligence, as he was able to learn much more information. It has now become obvious that the future did not change, but no one knew about the substitution of the relic. The theft was committed as quietly as it is today. The organization of the Secret Star had to be done more carefully due to Vega's constant surveillance. The last thing I needed was to get involved in a war between underground guilds and heroes, but there was no other choice. The young man received a substituted artifact, and the absorption did not occur. Perhaps it was due to dark energy. At that moment, he did not regret that he had touched the previous cup and managed to take away its power. A bad day suddenly became very productive. Clyde felt happy. He became even closer to gaining power and wealth. Now all that was left was to eliminate the cultist killer who was following the swindler's trail. Meanwhile, the young man explored the depths of the cave, looking for the object of his order. He was very nervous because he could not return to his leader empty-handed. In the end, the killer's nerves completely failed him, and he began to shout the target, not holding back in his statements. The cultist didn't even realize that Clyde was behind him. The rogue attacked his opponent from behind, piercing him through with a spear. He did not seek to kill his opponent with one blow. The Sky Demon needed information, and this was his chance to get it. The bearer of the Lyre constellation used his stigma against the guy. This was supposed to make communication more productive. The plan turned out to be effective, and the wounded sectarian expressed a desire to tell everything in more detail. All Clyde had to do was listen carefully and remember. At the same moment, on the other side of the world, members of the Order of the Black Star emerged from the portal. The guild elder, Edwin, waited patiently for his men to arrive, and he was pleased when the blonde humbly bowed his head before him. The rest of the group instantly materialized around them, turning from birds into people. The word of Edwin, the Bird King, carried enormous weight in the magical world. Everyone was waiting for the ceremony to begin. The magic moon circle was created in a few seconds. The blonde had to take the relic to the center. When the cup came into contact with the ritual attribute, a reaction should have started immediately. The blonde insisted on full attention. It was impossible to be distracted from the ritual. The incredible power of the relic was meant to strengthen the might of the Order of the Dark Star. But no matter how hard the squad leader tried, nothing worked. No transformations took place with the relic. The blonde realized that his mission had failed. He had lost the real artifact. Now a severe punishment from the guild leader was to be expected. And Edwin really did look like he was ready to kill everyone on the lawn. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, it became known that the members of the Dark Star Society had already created dark constellations. Clyde was very interested in understanding the fundamental difference between them and ordinary constellations. But when explaining it, it seemed like the guy was listening to an ancient legend, without any specifics. The heavenly demon had neither the time nor the desire to do this. It took some effort to get the scoundrel to reveal the location of the guild base. But he only knew the location of his branch, not the command post. In the middle of the sect, there was an extremely developed system of information branching. Ordinary soldiers were not allowed access to sensitive data. Because of this, Clyde could not understand the reasons for the Six's 100% submission to the management. Because from the point of view of the guy, the killer on the contrary, there was no benefit from it. Voicing such thoughts out loud made the interlocutor think. The heavenly demon did not force the captive to answer immediately. And as a result, he received an explanation. Obedience was maintained because the killer had gained strength. All Sixes joined this guild to say goodbye to their ordinary lives and become heroes. The swindler heard about this for the first time. He thought that only gods were capable of this. This bait was very attractive to people who decided to significantly change their quality of life. Realizing that he would not get anything more out of the enemy, Clyde decided to end the interrogation. The interlocutor, in turn, threatened to take his life. He immediately began to shout about his own pardon, citing the children waiting at home. As it turned out, it was his daughter who was the reason he joined the sect. It sounded like the child was an excuse for everything. Of course, it would be hard for an orphan to survive alone in a cruel world. But the information could be a lie. To verify the truth of the information, the heavenly demon decided to ask a few more questions. It was necessary to inquire about the smallest details about the girl. Most likely, there could have been some very insignificant trinkets among them. The main thing is that there are about 10 questions. This won't be a big effort for the father. And then, we can move on to the most interesting part. After the last answer, the prisoner had to repeat everything stated above in reverse order, without making a mistake in any of the answers. The plan worked out perfectly. The enemy really did resort to tricks. He became confused during the second stage of interrogation. This became a signal for decisive reprisals, but in reality for the appearance of the latter. The murderer again began to beg for mercy, honestly declaring that he did not want to die. But the only chance for his survival was information about the main base of the Dark Star Society. After receiving the information, Clyde did not hesitate any longer and eliminated the villain. The guy didn't need any ballast that could attack him from behind. Now it was time to deal with the guild, which turned out to be quite a powerful organization. To cope with them, it was necessary to become stronger. And for this, at first it was possible to absorb the powers from a dead body. The stigma of the Dark Star felt like it had a completely different nature from the usual constellations. But there were no problems with assimilating such energy. Clyde was interested in trying out new abilities in practice, and to do this he needed to find an opponent. On the other hand, the young man felt that there should be no problems with this, because the killer would soon be sought. The heavenly demon really had to be careful because the clan leader was seeking revenge. Outwardly, Edwin remained calm and was even able to laugh at his subordinates' efforts. He said that Miles was needlessly panicking about the opinions of the other branches regarding the failure of the ritual. But a moment later, a beam as sharp as a blade cut the neck of his loyal vassal. The wound was not fatal, but it was on the edge. The elder ordered the blonde to no longer cause harm and his reputation to work without disappointment. The man suddenly lost interest in the conversation and quickly hurried off the lawn. As soon as Edwin's silhouette disappeared behind the trees, the first taunts were heard behind Miles. The blonde was left alone with a burning desire to avenge the shame. The first thing he did was visit his own headquarters. The man demanded an immediate report from his subordinates. The events in the dungeon, and especially the murder of the hero who sold them the cup, should have already been resolved. But there was still no news from the killer. They couldn't contact him at all. Miles ordered that the loser be found immediately and the reason for the delay be determined. And it wasn't just curiosity, the blonde was ready to tear this six to shreds. Meanwhile, Clyde himself decided not to visit the dungeons anymore until he mastered his power. He spent all of Sunday training, trying to control the power of the third star, which had increased several times over. It was difficult for the guy to control even the maneuverability of his own body, because with increased mana, a good jump didn't require a lot of acceleration. But if efforts were made, it was possible in some cases to say goodbye to life. All that I have managed to comprehend in these days is that the stigma of the liar is very powerful. She surpassed in all respects the leading constellations, common among powerful heroes. Now, any warrior's 3 stars could not compare to Clyde's rank. The main problem now was Alan's weapon, which the swindler still used in battles. The young man did not have time to think about a solution to this problem, because Elizabeth was in need. She offered to give him a second massage, and he readily agreed because his whole body was in pain. The many days of training and loading have left their mark. Now that the girl was dominant, she could treat Clyde the same way he treated her. She hid her pleasure and care under a mask of rudeness and feigned malice. Elizabeth's hands were truly golden, and she had a great understanding of problems with overloaded backs. But sometimes the friend forgot about her extraordinary powers, which still remained in her hands. So Clyde had to remind himself out loud about his fragile constitution. When the massage was over, the guy was still grumbling with displeasure. Only Elizabeth's forgiveness stopped him. Looking back, he saw that his friend was sitting with her nose down, obviously upset. The young man realized that he had probably gone too far with his mentions of the girl's past capabilities. Yes, she was one of the most developed heroes, had 7 stars, but her injuries made her incapacitated. Therefore, unnecessary talk about strength and abilities could traumatize Elizabeth's already wounded soul. Clyde didn't know how to start the conversation or what to say in his defense. That's why my friend was the first to break the silence with a question about his accumulation. The information that her friend had managed to earn a whole bunch of money upset the girl even more. Material stability meant their imminent separation. But Elizabeth did not want this, because she was already accustomed to such company. She knew that Clyde's dream was to raise 10 billion, and the goal was closer than ever. The friend wished her friend all the best, but she felt that on the day of separation her life would end. Suddenly, the surge of spleen ended in violence and laughter. Elizabeth tried to hide her emotions behind a dose of sarcasm, returning to the previous settings. At the most cheerful moment, the heavenly demon's phone rang. It was Ben, who, it turned out, was having a serious conversation with a member of his guild. He didn't want to give away details like that, only said that he had an interesting task. At first, Clyde wanted to refuse. He didn't want to come out of the shadows because of the Dark Star Alliance. But the mention of a cash reward of 2 billion made the young man instantly forget about caution. Ben knew exactly how to motivate a selfish guild member. A second later, Clyde announced that he was already on his way to the association and agreed to meet halfway. Less than half an hour had passed before the fraudster had already entered the building. He decided to combine business with pleasure by finding out some important information. While absorbing the killer's powers in the dungeon, the young man remembered his stigma. He needed to find out what it was. Ben was happy to help with this. After rummaging around on his tablet for a bit, the guild leader found the information he needed. This stigma was called the owl stigma. Clyde needed more advanced details on this issue. Therefore, the interlocutor continued to explain that it turned out that she was classified as forgotten. Even in the beginning, when the constellations appeared in the world, they were mentioned along with others. But then the mysteries about this symbol suddenly disappeared, and no one attached any special significance to it. Clyde realized that the Dark Star sect had been in existence for about 8 years. Since this was not a new organization, caution had to be doubled. And, in addition to this, prepare well, because the next meeting with them is inevitable. Bennu, the young man decided to tell in general terms everything that had happened to him. The young man even named the Dark Guild to get him to pay attention to him. The interlocutor willingly learned more about the amazing organization. He had heard absolutely nothing about the Dark Star Alliance until this moment. It was time to talk about the task. The request was made by the Valhalla Guild, considered the coolest. Each member of this group is gifted with a variety of talents, including extraordinary leadership. As long as this man had already reached the 7-star threshold, he could become equal to Elizabeth. The 7-star heroes were considered the strongest, having crossed human potential. Valhalla's leader was of Korean descent, So it was important for the country to have another such warrior. Today, the members of the association were required to find a missing person in one of the dungeons. The boy was last seen on November 6th, but the exact location was unknown. So far, Clyde was satisfied with all the conditions, even the approximate discrepancy in the radius of simple dungeons. He often carried out his fraudulent activities there. But when Alan's name was mentioned and his detailed description of his appearance was given, everything changed. Ben waited for his subordinate to respond, but he couldn't get a sound out. The heavenly demon never thought that a time traveler could have relatives or friends. Due to his busy life, Clyde has forgotten the circumstances of his formation in recent days. But the real regressor seemed reluctant to let him go free. From Ben's story, the boy understood that the one he saw in the vision was the time traveler's brother. He was the leader of the Valhalla Guild, named Kenneth, and Clyde's intervention changed his family's life. Moreover, the whole reality has now changed, and this has become more obvious than ever. The guy began to feel anxious from the thoughts that were rolling in from all sides, and he demanded time to think. A lot of troubles surrounded the fraudster's personality now, and he did not know how to deal with it without losses. But suddenly the solution came by itself. A scientist who has lived a lie for years, Clyde decided to pit his two enemies against each other. Ben needed to refuse now to begin his subtle game. The guild leader's reaction was eloquent. He did not expect such an answer from someone who wanted money. The fraudster claimed that he had never searched for people before and did not understand anything about it. Finally, to avoid leaving empty-handed, he asked for Alan's brother's phone number. Apparently, so that I could contact Kenneth myself in the future, if necessary. As he left the association building, he was already developing a cunning plan. First, it was necessary to catch a person from the Dark Star clan. So the guy wandered around in all possible locations where portals appeared near the dungeon. He knew he must be being watched, but he had not yet seen any observers nearby. Today, as always, the young man wandered among the crowd of heroes who were busy with their own affairs. Even unexpectedly, his body felt the proximity of someone's thirst for murder. Looking around, Clyde saw a man in a suit in the crowd. It was a man looking at him, talking on the phone. It was certain that the potential killer was a stalker from the Dark Star clan. The heavenly demon jumped up and ran towards the deserted streets. He ran to some park and hid an ambush. It didn't take long to wait for the sect member. He soon appeared on the alley, looking around. Of course, he didn't see anyone, but he didn't lose hope of completing the task. At the right moment, Clyde stepped into the light and attracted attention. He understood that there would be a fight, but he considered his advantage obvious. The pursuer unexpectedly attacked him first with the owl's stigma. The swindler barely managed to dodge the attack. He did not take into account the tenacity and ability of the enemy, but he still had the upper hand in strength, so he moved on to finish the confrontation. With the help of the lightning spear, the battle was over in a few seconds. The villain was all steam, and the heavenly demon hoped that his phone had survived. The observer was not weak, so the power of the branch leaders of the organization needed careful preparation. Not to mention the head of the entire sect, the process of self-improvement needed to be accelerated. But now the immediate problem was finding Alan. Taking the dead man's phone in his hands, Clyde confidently dialed the number of Kenneth's guild. First, prudently, having photographed the regressor's spear as proof of the truth. It's time to introduce new characters into the game. Alan's brother was powerful enough to deal with the villains, at least some of them. The head's assistant, named Audrey, the same black-haired girl from the vision, took the earphone. She tried to refuse Clyde's request to talk to the leader. But the swindler was not going to back down so easily. He announced that he had found Alan. This statement changed the whole attitude towards the stranger from the tube. Audrey hurried with a report to Kenneth. Before connecting the two interlocutors, she briefly recounted the content of the preliminary dialogue. Alan's brother, without losing his composure, asked for details. He thought that it was an ordinary hero calling, but it turned out that he was in contact with a car thief. Clyde, on behalf of Miles, whose name he had learned in the dungeon, assured his interlocutor of the kidnapping. To confirm his words, he sent Kenneth a photograph of his brother's spear. Now, the leader of the Valhalla Guild took this call very seriously, and although the man was still trying to maintain his appearance, it was clear that it was very difficult for him. Clyde couldn't help but smile because it meant his plan was working. It was not an act to be proud of, but it was not the cause of Alan's death in this world. After waiting the right amount of time for Kenneth to become more nervous, the Sky Demon clearly and loudly called out Miles's name as the one responsible for the kidnapping. The leader of the Valhalla Guild saw his whole life flash before his eyes. He remembered the times when he was little and looked up to his older brother as if he was all-powerful. They were extremely close and Alan always tried to take care of Kenneth. The teenager helped the boy in everything, like a superhuman, although at that time he did not have such abilities. But the sudden arrival of monsters to the Earth changed everything. After years of hiding and saving his life, the first superhumans began to appear on the planet, and Kenneth was among them. He received the stigma of the Leo constellation, one of the most important, while Alan remained an ordinary man. Although the older brother didn't show it, he was tormented by the thought that he couldn't protect the younger one. And the younger one plunged headlong into his new life, full of adventures. Day after day, they moved further and further away from each other without noticing it. This was natural due to the difference in abilities and, accordingly, in purpose. Eventually, a gap formed between the two close people. This state of affairs continued until Alan acquired the stigma. The Compass constellation seemed to heal the guy from the inside, and the two brothers had a chance to establish communication. The first step towards reconciliation was a gift from the younger to the elder, the same spear. It was a special artifact that Alan immediately took a liking to. The guy promised to take care of the weapon and look after it. And so, today, Kenneth looked at this spear on the phone screen and could not believe what had happened. The photograph made it clear that there was no question of a fake. The longer the Valhalla Guildmaster looked at the screen, the more he felt the need to vent his anger. When he learned the name of the hijacker, he finally lost control of himself. Clyde, having said everything he had planned, simply hung up. Now the guy could only wait and watch how events would develop. There was silence in Kenneth's office. He was still standing with the phone to his ear. Suddenly, Audrey was thrown back by a wave of energy that scattered in all directions from the leader. The girl tried to calm the elder, but this was only possible with the help of a loud scream. The guild leader almost instantly got his feelings under control. There was an urgent need to take action, so he ordered his assistant to contact the association immediately. At Ben's request, Clyde brought Miles's portrait by morning. The guy understood perfectly well that this was connected with Kenneth's orders. And I was shocked by the development of my game. This man really had a huge impact on the heroic environment. The swindler wanted to believe that the Dark Star sect would not be able to resist the power of Brother Alan. Ben, meanwhile, could not believe such a strange coincidence. They were looking for the very man Clyde had seen. In addition, the Valhalla Guild asked for any help. They needed help in besieging the area where the hijacker had arranged to meet. And although the interlocutor did not dare to offer the young man this task, he himself unexpectedly agreed. The heavenly demon's opinion was simple. To control the situation, he needed to be nearby. Besides, Clyde wanted to see with his own eyes the clash between the two people with whom he had problems. It was already getting dark around the main base of the Dark Star sect. And although outwardly everything looked calm, inside punishment was taking place. Miles listened to the report from the duty spy regarding the surveillance of the stranger from the dungeon. The scoundrel was seen at the exit of the association building, and this gave rise to some thoughts. Because after that, the spy checked whether he belonged to this organization. But he did not appear there for a single day after his visit. That is, he was not considered an employee. It looked unusual and strange and made even Miles himself think. The stranger's identity required more careful study, but it was not known how this could be done. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by the appearance of another subordinate. He was rushing with news. According to the new arrival, a man who looked like a collector was approaching the observatory building. Miles himself volunteered to remove the wayward traveler. He needed someone to vent his anger on. Going outside the building, near one of the walls, he saw some kind of artifact. It was a pretty good spear, one could even say beautiful, but the branch leader didn't pay any attention to it. He walked down the lawn, leaving the find for later. A couple of minutes later, the blonde ran into the collector. Or at least that's what he thought. The man in the hat with the bun behind his back was in no hurry to enter into dialogue. So Miles did it first, trying to make a good impression on the stranger. He had no idea that it was Kenneth himself who stood before him. The collector did not respond to his interlocutor's words, and a tense silence reigned between the two men. The blonde tensed up. He began to suspect that something was fishy in this situation. The passerby looked extremely sinister and did not at all correspond to the image of an ordinary villager. Kenneth remained silent only because he was waiting for a report from his men. And when they reported that Alan's spear had been found, the leader of the Valhalla Guild attacked. A powerful vortex of energy began to spread around, leaving Miles no chance of escape. It was only when the hero's hat flew off that the leader of the Dark Star branch realized who was hiding underneath. The presence of Kenneth the Black Lion on the lawn near the observatory awakened some kind of primeval fear. But the situation did not allow the blonde to escape. He had to protect his people and the interests of the organization. Obviously, Alan's brother could not kill the enemy without knowing the location of his relative. He calmly reported that he had collected the required amount of money in cash. The man didn't notice how genuinely surprised Miles was in response to these words. Rage completely closed his eyes and he wanted to pay back and attacked again. Kenneth decided to make his next strike from above. He hadn't even reached the enemy yet, and the latter already didn't know what to do with himself. At the last moment, the Valhalla Guild leader changed his trajectory and landed behind the enemy. He took this as a signal that most likely the opponent was not there on his own. And he was not mistaken, because a moment later, the members of the group and everyone who wanted to help appeared behind the lion's command. The Valhalla Guild members immediately ran towards the observatory with the intention of destroying the enemy. Miles saw the zeal with which strangers were cracking open the organization's long-standing wealth. Members of his branch, hearing the noise, tried to resist, but it was brutally suppressed. Soon the sounds of a fierce struggle could be heard inside the building. Meanwhile, Kenneth continued to remain in place. He did not want to lose sight of the kidnapper. And most importantly, I wanted to find out information about my brother. But the answer did not satisfy him at all. Miles had no idea who they were talking about. Meanwhile, Clyde was not far from the observatory and was watching the spectacular aurora. From a distance, it seemed like the game was going exactly according to plan. All that was needed was to wait a little longer. The Valhalla Guildmaster felt like the kidnapper was mocking him, so he moved on to another attack. Miles had to urgently defend his life, although he understood that the fight was not on equal terms. The protective barrier that the leader of the Dark Star branch had managed to create could barely withstand the pressure of the hero's energy. Victory could be forgotten. The talk was already about the elementary preservation of one's own existence. This treacherous attack was completely unprovoked and gave rise to logical suspicions. All these questions about his brother and money sounded like complete nonsense to Miles. But judging by the enemy's anger, he took it at face value and demanded satisfaction. Another blow from Kenneth threw the enemy more than 10 meters away. The blonde hit the ground. The hero was not going to stop there. He began to approach with the desire to complete the task. Now there was talk about killing the Black Lion itself, which sounded completely paradoxical. It finally dawned on Miles. They were insidiously trying to get rid of him at the hands of the leader of the Valhalla Guild. He didn't want to make such a powerful enemy, so he planned to prove his innocence. But all ideas on this matter disappeared after another powerful blow from the hero. Wounded, falling to the ground, Miles could only scream about innocence and error. But Kenneth did not believe a word his enemy said. Persuasion was a waste of time. The moment had come when it was time to run. The leader of the Dark Star branch felt that he had several serious injuries. Another attack could kill him. So he used the stigma to distract his opponent with a whirlwind of black feathers. Now Kenneth had to fight an obstacle, and Miles had time. Clyde watched the activation of the Owl constellation from his hiding place and prepared for active action. The head of the Valhalla Guild saw the kidnapper trying to commit suicide and rushed towards him. The blonde actually drove a dagger into his chest, but he had a completely different goal. A moment later, only the confused hero remained on the lawn. Kenneth didn't understand where his opponent had gone, but the perfect moment had passed. Meanwhile, about half a kilometer from the observatory, in the middle of the forest, Miles teleported. His condition left much to be desired, the leader of the Dark Star branch coughing up blood. But he was pleased that he had managed to save his life from a senseless death. Although, it probably didn't last long, because the body clearly gave signals that it was on the edge. Besides, now at the base, his subordinates were dying at the hands of brutal attackers without a chance of victory. The idea came to mind to ask Edwin for help. It was a risky adventure because the blonde had already compromised himself as a leader. He was so immersed in his thoughts that he did not hear the stranger approaching from behind. Until Clyde uttered a few sarcastic words, Miles didn't even look back in his direction. But when he saw a stranger from the dungeon in front of him, fear immediately turned to surprise. Putting two and two together required a lot of effort. It was the work of a cunning scoundrel. First, he cunningly replaced the cup, and now he tried to eliminate the branch of the organization. Clyde literally saw each thought flash across the sectarian's face in turn. It was the best gift that could have ended the day. Now he just wanted to finish what Kenneth had started, away from prying eyes. Obviously, Miles didn't intend to die, so there were some problems with the murder. Even activating the stigma of the liar did not help to quickly resolve this issue. The villain still tried to resist with the last of his strength. Despite the excruciating pain and blood loss, these efforts had an effect. But they also hastened the inevitable end without immediate treatment. But Clyde couldn't be stopped, especially when he saw how badly the enemy was doing. Eventually, the lightning energy engulfed the entire clearing. When the hellish attack was over, only one of the opponents remained on his feet. The scammer never managed to learn anything from Miles during that short period of time. Until his death, he was physically tormented by the mere mention of the Dark Star's communication. The only thing that became clear was that the leader of the sect had the name Edwin, and now it was his turn. Of course, there had to be a pause between the destruction of the branch of conspirators and the raid on the head. The young man did not want to be hunted by all the followers of the owl stigma at once, but this dilemma could be solved differently. Cunning sparkled in the eyes of the heavenly demon. Since he was truly working on the side of good, it was necessary to create a worthy antagonist. And the Dark Star sect was better suited to the role of creators of the villain who destroyed the world. The only problem in this confrontation was the power of the adepts. Even Miles would have been impossible to handle on his own without Kenneth's help. And he was only the leader of one of the branches of the organization. What can we say about the real chairman? Whether Edwin had power like the Great Reaper was impossible to know without meeting him in person. In any case, this question was not yet acute. It was possible to simply absorb the blonde's power. In the enemy's pocket, the swindler found 2 giant myrrh crystals. It was an impressive haul, considering the takeover hadn't even happened yet. No other valuable things were found, but this is something to be thankful for. Now it was time to move on to using the power of the dark skies. This time, the dead one turned out to be very useful for the progression of black skills. Clyde's scores soared to level 3 enlightenment, or so the system claimed. But the sensations could not be called good. Just like the last time during the absorption, the heavenly demon once again saw a vision of the future through Alan's eyes. As the giant dragon ravaged everything around them, the brothers tried to agree on a plan of action. The time traveler wanted Kenneth to save his life and the lives of his loved ones. He took it upon himself to distract the monster as much as he could. But the head of the Valhalla Guild was not delighted with such a proposal. Even the assurance that his brother would run away if he realized the gravity of the situation did not change his mind. So Alan decided not to argue anymore and simply flew off to attack the enemy. But besides the dragon, it turned out that there were other giant monsters nearby, and one of them just set its course towards the hero. But the monster's efforts were in vain. The time traveler easily cut the villain in half. He didn't want to delay even for a second in order to be as productive as possible in protecting his loved ones. But after a few seconds, a second obstacle appeared behind the first one. This time the enemy looked even more vile. An amorphous mass with many paws crawled out onto the ruins of what were once such beautiful buildings and opened its mouth wide. Such a monster could not be left alive, so there was no choice. Alan took up a position to counterattack, although he knew that the monster would be very difficult to deal with. He reproached himself for the carelessness that allowed such a creature to survive until today. In general, the guy blamed only himself for all the troubles of humanity, which now stand in all their glory. And this thought was the last one that Clyde managed to comprehend before coming to his senses. He understood that it was very useful to see such visions, but he could not get used to feeling unwell. After passing through another circle of hell, the system notified about the received assets and a new rank. Now the dark skies have gained the ability to infinitely converge, whatever that means. After rummaging through the settings, Clyde realized that from now on, the liar's stigma was linked to a dark entity. And if you improve the main indicators, the others will also improve. In addition, the fraudster clearly saw that he could finally calmly activate the skills of the owl stigma. And besides, to master these powers at a sufficiently powerful level, all that was left now was to pump oneself up. He could no longer worry about the other abilities and focus only on the main constellation. In order not to arouse suspicion among his guild and Kenneth, the boy decided to injure himself with the owl's stigma. He woke up sometime later from Ben's screams above his head. As it turned out, the man used a healing potion to bring the heavenly demon back to consciousness. Heroes walked around and shared information about the victims and the opposition. Clyde pretended to be a man who didn't know where he was in order to maintain the legend. Ben readily explained that the young man was found here, and an ambulance was even called to take him to the hospital. Most likely, the hero was wounded during a fight with a villain. The heavenly demon was not eager to crash into the ward, so he hastened to assure that he felt well. The most important thing for the guy was to find out Kenneth's point of view regarding the current situation. He found a man standing away from the rest of the team, lost in thought. And although they were meeting in person for the first time, it turned out that the leader of the Valhalla Guild knew Clyde's name. This made the task much easier, especially considering the need to consolidate the result of the game. Kenneth looked thoughtfully at Miles's corpse, reproaching himself for never having been able to interrogate him. The heavenly demon, with a sad expression on his face, said that he himself could not find out anything. Seeming to have remembered a little, after a pause, The young man said that the enemy was retreating in a specific direction. In this way, he hoped to direct his allies in the direction he needed. There, in the thick of the forest, he left the body so he knew exactly where to lead Brother Alan. When Kenneth saw the remains of his loved one, he suddenly turned into an ordinary guy. No longer able to contain his excessive emotions, the man fell to the ground and began to cry out loud. Clyde stood silently to the side and watched what was happening. It was impossible to guess that there was another person lying on the ground, although that was exactly the case. Although the con man was not directly involved in Alan's death, he could not reveal his whereabouts. Having satisfied the Valhalla Guildmaster's need to find his brother, he lifted the burden off himself. Clyde wanted to believe that he was simply a victim of circumstances, and the young man convinced himself of this every day. But it was impossible to hide from his conscience. The guy had appropriated the powers of a regressor that did not belong to him. Sunday, after the emotions had calmed down a bit, Kenneth invited the heavenly demon to the guild base. The first thing the man did was apologize for his behavior during the previous meeting. It was clear from his appearance that he had not yet internally experienced the loss. The poor fellow was holding on with all his might. The purpose of the invitation was to express gratitude for the enormous assistance in finding his brother. The guild leader was confident that it was Clyde who had put in the most effort to find the enemy. From the outside, it looked exactly like that, because the guy made a significant contribution to determining the identity of the kidnapper. But the fraudster did not expect that he would be rewarded with a material reward for this. Kenneth announced that there were $3 billion in the suitcase. It was the ransom for Alan, who was no longer needed. Clyde tried to refuse, but realized that the reason for the reward lay somewhat deeper. He decided to listen to his interlocutor's proposal before refusing again. The conversation turned to the regressor's abilities, which was already commonplace. Kenneth also knew from Ben that Clyde had met with the Dark Starsec squad before. Based on this information, he offered to join Valhalla in destroying the top of the organization. Even the cunning man himself could not have predicted such an unexpected turn of events. He was unexpectedly offered help and money for what the guy already had as a goal. After appearing to think carefully about the proposal, Clyde agreed after a certain pause. Once the decision was made, discussions of details and exchange of information began. The heavenly demon willingly passed on to his interlocutor information about Edwin and his location. The leader of the Valhalla Guild was amazed that he got what he wanted in such a short time. Clyde confirmed with a smile that these were indeed the coordinates of the one responsible for Alan's kidnapping. After meeting his new colleagues, the young man went down to Ben's floor and reported the latest news. Since he was hunting with the regressor's brother, he needed to change his weapon. Therefore, the young man decided to discuss this issue with the elder of his guild. He brought in a project for consideration of a spear that he had invented himself, with the trick of being a harpoon. Ben enjoyed the essays and was eager to discuss them further. Once the smallest details were clarified, the leader happily agreed to the bracelet project. The husband promised to take care of the production of artifacts, after which the conversation turned to the price of the issue. Although Clyde had managed to earn a lot of money, he hated to part with it. So the news that the association would cover all expenses came as manna from heaven. It was a kind of gratitude for the efforts in the search operation led by Kenneth. These words made the young man's conscience speak again more strongly for his cunning and thirst. At the same time, he realized that no one except Elizabeth cared about him like that. He rushed to the leader with hugs, claiming that he was very grateful for the help. There was no need to speed up the masters. The quality of the equipment was important for the stigma of the liar. Under the influence of the disarming attack of love from the regressor, Ben became completely touched. The hero never ceased to amaze, especially when he suddenly announced that he would pay for the spear himself. So much time had passed in the adventures that Clyde almost did not believe that he had finally reached home. To his surprise, for the first time Elizabeth did not respond from the room. I had to get very close to my friend so that she could comprehend the presence of another person. A normal, casual conversation took place between the girl and the boy. Elizabeth, although she was glad to see her loved one, could not tolerate some manifestations of the guy's character. She couldn't tell her friend the truth that she had been carrying inside for a long time. The girl was working on solving her vision problem and didn't want to burden anyone with it. A suitable lot has now appeared at the relics auction. It was possible to fight for the eyes of the demon dragon, but this required funds. As he had done in the days leading up to the raid, Clyde decided to spend his time training in self-improvement instead of seeking adventure. The only thing that brought him out of this process was a conversation with Ben, who had some news. It was about a relic from the dungeon that the swindler brought with him. It was a 3-star artifact. The heavenly demon had no intention of using the Dark Star Society's counterfeit, so he agreed to sell it. He understood perfectly well that such an artifact could fetch a substantial sum of money. But I didn't expect to hear such a large payment announced by Ben. Together with two myrrh crystals from Miles, the whole thing could be worth around 2 billion. Clyde's mouth watered at the news. So the operation, which seemed completely unprofitable, brought the fraudster almost 5 billion. At this rate, he should soon reach the 10 billion mark in savings. But it was not worth stopping there. The young man set himself the goal of exploring the sewers for monsters. Ben didn't even ask why he was asking him for a map, he just agreed to help. While spending yet more hours training, the guy kept thinking about money. And I didn't expect the sudden appearance of Vega, who happily jumped out of the medallion. She had not been seen for 3 Sundays, and so it was necessary to recount an abridged version of recent events. Clyde did not forget to distribute the pre-planned version of Edwin to the goddess. Of course, he pretended that he couldn't give a 100% guarantee, but he referred to his well-founded suspicions about the Dark Star sect. The guy was also very interested in the circumstances under which this union came into being. He thought that the patroness of the Weavers had information on this matter, but the answer disappointed him. All that's left is to rely on one's own strength and tricks to get to the truth. But first, he had to satisfy Vega's demands and demonstrate his upgrade. The guy took the spear in his hands and prepared to activate the stigma. This time it was as if he himself had turned into lightning. Weeks of training had not passed without a trace. Changing trajectory on the fly and easily executing various maneuvers, Clyde was like a fish in water. The goddess watched the regressor's sharp movements almost with horror. She didn't expect to miss out on such a transformation during her absence. The guy flew into the sky, diligently weighing his capabilities and masterfully adjusting to them. The highlight of the demonstration was the use of lightning. A blue glow illuminated the horizon, as if competing with the bright sunset. When Clyde landed on the roof of the house, Vega hurried to approach him. She honestly reported that she was very impressed with the progress of the Apostle of the Lyre. But the scammer was guided by the woman's expression, so he realized that there was a problem somewhere. It turned out that the goddess was interested in using the stigma in 3 different places. The young man assured that everything worked out only thanks to his desire and persistence in training. But this answer made the interlocutor think even more. She remembered perfectly well Clyde's words about him not remembering anything about the stigma technique. There could be no other explanation than subconscious mastery. Vega again asked questions and answered them on her own, thus freeing the fraudster from the need to come up with interesting stories. Now the young man had no choice but to pretend to be genuinely surprised and to play along with all of his interlocutor's remarks. But everything turned out to be not so simple. The goddess could not understand how the human body could withstand such force. A phone call saved the woman from yet another interrogation by the heavenly demon. Ben seemed to have a sense of when it was time to save people. As it turned out, Clyde's order was ready for use. All that was left was to try out the equipment. At first glance, the spear was exactly as the guy had intended. Vega couldn't take her eyes off the Apostle's new artifact. Her head was filled with a multitude of questions. The weapon's execution was striking in its perfection, so the swindler became interested in the master himself. The harpoon worked perfectly and, in the opinion of the goddess, was an ingenious trap for enemies. But this was not the only thing the young man had planned to use it for. With one precise movement, the guy fired a shot in the direction of the neighboring building. After making sure that the rope was secure, Clyde and Vega decided to take a short trip. They flew over the street feeling a mixture of horror and delight. It turned out to be a really cool idea that totally paid off. A few seconds later, the woman herself appreciated the extraordinary benefits of such an invention. But Clyde himself learned something new. It turns out that the Lyra constellation allowed for flight. But this skill was not yet available. The goddess wanted to end the time of adventures and go home, but the young man had his own plans. He was looking forward to new achievements, as he finally received a personal weapon. Therefore, the swindler now considered exploring the station in search of the monster to be a great way to spend his time. But first, it was necessary to ensure the ability to recover from unforeseen events. To do this, the regressor entered the hero goods store and selected everything he needed. Once again, the guy was shocked by the exorbitant prices for services that seemed like a crime to him. He explained to Vega his most serious reaction to the need to accumulate. The goddess immediately expressed her condolences over the fact that she could not help in any way now. She did not want her apostle to be in need of anything and to be in a difficult situation. Once the smallest nuances have been taken into account, it is time to move on to the active phase of the search. And although the entire tunnels were difficult to navigate, Clyde was almost certain that he was going in the right direction. There was no point in fearing an attack from the monster while it was under the seal of containment. Vega was delighted with her protege's cunning plan. Liquidation before awakening. You couldn't think of anything better. There was only one bad thing about this situation. The guy's shoes were hopelessly ruined. After about a few minutes, the goddess pointed to something in the distance at the branching of the tunnel. It wasn't an object, but rather a feeling of ominous energy, but it couldn't be ignored. According to the map, there was a dead end in that direction, a little further. But there was no mistake. Clyde trusted his companion's premonitions more than the documents. The woman continued to share her feelings, which for some reason differed from her previous experience. The heavenly demon remembered his opinion that this matter needed careful investigation, but the need for active action came first. The path into the unknown turned out to be not so long, but at the end, a dangerous surprise awaited the visitors in the form of two monsters. These were man-eating lizards, who were currently keeping an eye on the visitors. The guy encountered such mutants for the first time and aroused his curiosity. They didn't pose much of a threat at Clyde's current level of development. Therefore, he willingly accepted the duel. The young man's movements were much faster than the reactions of his opponents. But a simple fight with weapons against monsters turned out to be powerless. That's why stigma had to be applied. The effect was almost immediate. The villains experienced his pain very strongly. The spear was the best way to transfer any tactics from the constellation of the Liar, because it was completely electrified in the process. This artifact was many times superior to Alan's weapon, becoming a deadly obstacle for enemies. Despite the victory, it was too early to celebrate, because a flock of similar ones had already lined up behind the first two. The apostle and the goddess realized that they would have to sweat in order to reach their destination. The guy decided to enjoy the process and not get irritated over trifles. He decided to use a new technique that would make the situation much easier. Having pulled the ropes on his hands with the help of bracelets on both sides of the tunnel, the young man simply waited for the attack. The mutants finally rushed to attack, not understanding the reasons for the man's strange behavior. The freaks had to be allowed as close as possible so that the effect would work with maximum losses. A few seconds later, Clyde activated his stigma again and everything around him was illuminated with blue light. It quickly moved to the walls of the dungeon and captured a cluster of enemies. None of the creatures that moved along vertical planes could survive such an electric shock. To be honest, the scammer couldn't even imagine that the plan would be so effective. But not all creatures fell into the trap. Some mutants turned out to be smarter than their minions. But no matter how hard they tried, the end was the same for everyone. Death without the right to pardon. Having quickly dealt with the last of the survivors, the heavenly demon still couldn't catch his breath. Apparently, the main man appeared in front of him. The reptilian leader was at least half the size of his vassals. The mutants obeyed him unquestioningly and, despite the certain death, ran towards the enemy. The bracelets, in this case, would not have such a good effect. It was necessary to act based on the new circumstances, so Clyde rushed towards the monsters. Using the power of stigma, the young man created an electrical vortex around himself. This made it possible to neutralize several of the first opponents at once, but those were immediately replaced by about a dozen more with no less thirst for murder. The guy froze for a moment, thinking about his next step. This could be perceived as weakness, and the lizards finally fell for the bait. It was easier to direct my power in a confined space than in an open space. The forward flight literally swept the enemies off the face of the earth. Clyde had no compassion for creatures that did nothing but terrorize people. The guy got some kind of amazing pleasure from the suffering of his opponents. The too easy destruction of the ogres finally got on the young man's nerves. Even after he had destroyed the leader, the swindler still felt like there was a big trap waiting for him ahead. The list of oddities also included the myrrh crystals of monsters that were black in color. Like the goddesses, the regressor knew nothing about such artifacts. Most likely, this was connected with the organization of dark stars, as much as one would like to admit it. Too many coincidences have been haunting the guy lately on his way to his goal. Despite his suspicions and feelings, Clyde was not going to give up on completing the mission. Now there were no more obstacles between the main monster from the vision and the hero. Suddenly, a bright light illuminated the other side of the tunnel. The previous dead end was a magical cover. Visitors were presented with a completely new space, striking in its scale. It was a huge hall in which any person would feel insignificant. And at one of the walls of this space, Clyde finally saw the one he was looking for. The monster from Alan's memories was indeed striking in size. Its mouth was hidden in a fold of its amorphous body. Now the guy also began to feel the extremely creepy aura of the monster. The heavenly demon remembered very well that in the vision the creature was much larger than it was now. This meant that the myrrh crystal she wore on her forehead had also been reduced in size. It was obvious that he wouldn't be able to cope with the monster of the future, but he could try to overcome it. Luckily, the guy's guess about the restraining seal turned out to be true. The creature didn't even move from the young man's test attack. This meant that the loot could be carried off without a fight. Clyde jumped into a vantage point and prepared to remove the crystal. But instead of doing this, he once again simply hit his opponent with a spear. He got so carried away by this process that he dropped one important detail. One of the enemy's hands moved. The goddess first noticed this and immediately pointed it out to the apostle. The awakening of the monster was not to the liking of either of them, because it would lead to great destruction. But something happened that was not desired. The creature began to move and threw the heavenly demon off itself. He fell to the floor and almost died immediately from the giant paw that landed next to him. The young man did not expect such a turn of events at all. Due to his carelessness, the whole plan could have gone down the drain. Moreover, having taken an advantageous position, the giant monster opened its mouth wide. The amorphous substance roared so powerfully that the young man froze in place in horror. It turns out that Alan's words were not taken as intended by Clyde. A true regressor has put his whole life on the line with the idea that he could change everything. Now the heavenly demon would have preferred to run away, but he couldn't do it because Vega was nearby. The woman heard that everything was under control, but inside the guy was confusedly trying to come up with a new plan. The swindler was inclined to think that he would die in a matter of minutes. Instead of ideas, birds were singing in his head. Meanwhile, the monster had already raised his hand for the first blow. The young man tried to prepare himself and take an advantageous position for defense. But of course, he was easily thrown back 10 meters. This creature was much different from anything Clyde had encountered before. After the first attack, the guy was immediately threatened by a second one. He could not count on a respite. By some miracle, the heavenly demon, already on the ground, managed to evade the attack. But it would be foolish to hope that next time we will be lucky too. The monster seemed to grow in size and become more and more ferocious with each passing second. Her screams made Clyde's ears pop. He couldn't stand the strong reverberation. Until the next plan of action had formed in my head, I had to constantly dodge attacks. Fortunately, the bracelets did not fail and served the customer faithfully. At some point, the monster's hand ended up under the guy. They were just trying to grab him. But the clever young man once again proved that the training was not in vain. It is unclear how he managed to turn around at the last second and jump onto the opponent's end. Now all that was needed was to run forward and move at maximum speed. This opportunity could not be lost. The only place that could be painful for the creature was the crystal. Pushing off the shoulder of the amorphous creature, Clyde flew into the air. He activated the stigma and aimed the spear straight at the desired point. The lightning energy from this strike reached the second level. The attack was successful. It seemed that after this one could relax, and this is what the swindler managed to do. This mistake cost the guy too much. The opponent finally caught him. The young man had no chance to escape the embrace of death, which was getting closer with every second. He couldn't believe that his opponent could survive a blow enhanced by the Lyre constellation. The heavenly demon wanted to live. He didn't want to be buried in such a vile body. Therefore, I resorted to all possible means to escape from the trap. When other methods failed, the young man took up a pistol. The stigma-enhanced bullet flew out in the direction of the freak's myrrh crystal. This time, the effect was stronger than the first time. The monster knocked its opponent to the ground. The fall was painful, but the swindler did not pay any attention to it. He was happy that he had avoided being taken over. All that was left was to hope that this ball was capable of making more than a spear, because the guy didn't have that many of these supplies, and standard techniques probably wouldn't work against the giant. It was necessary to come up with a way to bring down the giant with one powerful blow, and to do this it was necessary to approach to the appropriate distance. Clyde attached a harpoon to one of the enemy's limbs, but the monster reacted to this immediately. The guy flew into the air, hoping that he wouldn't fall into the hands of his opponent again. The amorphous creature began to change its position. So the guy had to come up with new ways to move around on the fly using the bracelets. It should be noted that he coped with this task brilliantly. Finding himself behind his enemy, Clyde praised himself for his ingenuity. The most powerful attack had to be carried out right now. A more ideal moment could not be imagined. This time, the heavenly demon decided to put his all into a decisive single blow. The spear, charged with a bright blue light, flew towards the enemy. Lightning has reached level 4 and unlocked the deep discharge skill. The whole being seemed to be absorbed by the energy of the Lyre constellation, which it could not resist. Now Clyde was in no hurry to celebrate until he was sure of his victory. And not in vain, because the monster decided to take one last revenge on humanity for his suffering. With one mad leap, he broke through his dungeon with the youth on his back. innocent bystanders trying to get to their destinations. Faced with mortal danger, they immediately began to run. Not everyone was lucky. A little guy was knocked down in a panic. He cried loudly, but no one paid attention. Looking back, the child froze in horror. The monster's mouth was too close. The creature's hand was already reaching out for its first prey. The boy began to cry and beg for help with redoubled force. This time, only one person heard him. Clyde rushed to cut the monster. The amazed observers stopped in the hope of seeing the act of a real hero. Vega, in turn, encouraged the child to run away from here while there was still a chance. The heavenly demon felt something that had been ridiculous to him until now: the need to protect ordinary people. The young man could not let down either the defenseless passersby or the goddess, who believed in him more than he did. This time, the patroness of the weavers herself offered to bestow a blessing on the apostle. But for the first time, he decided to refuse the gift. The preliminary blow inspired hope in his heart. In fact, Clyde himself was surprised. Today, he did everything the other way around. The guy liked the very feeling of adrenaline that he now experienced with every cell of his body. Regress wanted to repeat the deep discharge. It worked despite the insufficient power. It was necessary to hurry while the euphoria was still boiling in the blood. Clyde could see that the creature was still in pain and couldn't stop shaking its head. And this added a pinch of optimism to his plans. The guy prepared to make another attack to enhance the effect of his own presence. Thus, another confrontation began. This time, the cheater didn't have to put in much effort to avoid his opponent's giant hands. He maneuvered between them as if it were not a mortal danger but a dance. This was because the regressor finally understood the peculiar logic of the amorphous creature's movements. At the right moment, Clyde activated his stigma. He felt its power continue to grow. With a lightning-fast movement, the guy managed to gain an advantage. One of the monster's arms was cut off. Judging by the reaction, the freak had never had to endure such pain before. But the heavenly demon, one might say, was just warming up for the next round. By striking the ground with his spear, the boy generated thousands of lightning bolts that flew towards the enemy. This time, the depth charge really surpassed anything Clyde had created so far. It seemed that the monster's strength was rapidly leaving him. He lost his thirst for battle and tried to run away. But the guy didn't want to lose his prey. He decided to take advantage of the terrain. But with the help of the bracelets, I hit several large stones. Now the swindler had compelling arguments for dialogue. Each of the building's fragments flew towards the enemy, striking him. There was a strange transformation in his body, as if Clyde was on the edge of his capabilities. But, most likely, it was about the capabilities of the body itself, and not about the powers of the Lyra constellation. So there was an urgent need to release the accumulated potential. With this blow, the deep discharge reached the third level in front of the astonished spectators. When the lightning cleared, silence reigned and the monster stopped growling. A moment later, the monster fell to the ground. This was what a victory achieved completely independently looked like. Vega immediately inquired about the well-being of her apostle, but her worries could be thrown into the long closet. The young man was completely happy. In reality, it was bravado in front of a woman around whom he could not allow himself to be weak. People began to gather evenly around the hero. Almost everyone was filming him and thanking him for saving them. It was an incredible sight. It is obvious that after such an event, the whole country will talk about it. De-anonymization has occurred. Among the victims was a local newspaper reporter who immediately began asking questions. Clyde decided to give an interview and create a positive image in the eyes of the public. The audience did not leave the two interlocutors for a single step. Everyone was interested in listening to the life of the rescuer. Years of deception had not been in vain. The heavenly demon knew perfectly well what and when to say. Suddenly, the goddess intervened in the dialogue. Even Clyde didn't expect such behavior from Vega. The patroness of weaving advocated for material reward for her apostle. She was well aware of the regressor's need for funds and thus decided to help. The goddess directly demanded money from those present. Although this confused the ordinary people, they did not refuse the woman and took out their wallets. Thus, it was possible to collect 10,000 in a few minutes. And although at first Clyde tried to stop his mentor, now he was delighted that he had failed to do so. Upon reaching the association building, he immediately spoke with Ben about the media explosion. The excitement arose not only among the general population, but also in the heroic world. Money began to flow into the organization's fund, but this also brought a tax to the Apostle of the Lyra. To Ben's surprise, knowing about his desire to remain anonymous, Clyde reacted calmly to this. Having gained enough strength, one could not hide one's face. The interviewee also noted some comments about material rewards immediately after rescue. And while Clyde was trying to figure out how to get out of this awkward and shameful situation, Ben began, unexpectedly, to praise the hero for his ingenuity and genius. It turns out that the reporter not only interviewed the regressor, but also managed to take several photos. The main photo is of a guy standing up for a child despite the danger. The way the young man put a raincoat on the victim also did not escape the inquisitive eyes of the correspondent. Every word, every little thing in this article was written as if it didn't really happen. That's why the contrast with money works so well in bringing people back to reality. Clyde felt a strange sensation, as if he had found himself in the role of a Murtad, which he had previously personally led. But everything was not so simple. The resonant news reached paradise, where peace was immediately forgotten, which is why Ben had to call his guild member into conversation. But this was completely unimportant for now. The main thing was to sell the myrrh crystals. During his time wandering through the tunnels of the station, the guy managed to accumulate a solid collection. The head of the guild looked at each stone meticulously, muttering something under his breath. After completing the inspection, the man said that the price of such artifacts has now dropped significantly. The thing was that mutants began to appear more and more often, although they were previously considered rare. Despite this, the largest specimens could fetch around 400 million. Clyde agreed to all the conditions, with the expectation that he would receive the money in no more than a couple of days. But Ben reported a hurdle. The crystals were difficult to sell due to constant price fluctuations. This was indeed a problem that needed an immediate solution. Regress offered the association to pay him 300 million and take the rest for itself after the sale. Such a generous offer made the interlocutor lose control of himself. The guy, always very fond of money, literally gave them 100 million. Obviously, this plan could not be abandoned, and the agreement was concluded. Having clarified all the important questions for himself, the swindler, saying goodbye, rose from his seat, but Ben stopped him. He said that he had fulfilled the client's request and placed a small chest on the table. In addition to this item, a personal identification card of an authorized member of the association was also attached. When the guy picked it up, he felt like he had just joined the FBI. Even though these were two different structures, it is always nice to receive documents and improve your status, especially considering that the young man recently agreed to join the association. Clyde stepped outside and finally took a deep breath. None of the passers-by guessed that a large stone had fallen from the soul of a heavenly demon. The goal of picking up 1 billion was completed. Now it was a matter of getting less. The last step into paradise awaited the guy in just 2 days. Meanwhile, at home, Elizabeth listened to the latest news that had taken place in the country. Today, the announcer mainly talked about Clyde's actions and victories. After killing the monster, people gave the guy the nickname Lightning Wolf, and he became a hero savior. The girl was very pleased to hear good reviews about her friend. But the most important thing for her was to track the dragon's eye at the upcoming auction. This rare relic appeared unexpectedly after 15 months of absence from the horizon. Elizabeth believed that this was her last chance to improve her life. The girl was so immersed in her own experiences that she did not feel Vega's presence nearby. The goddess stayed home because Clyde didn't bring the pendant, so it was time for the women to talk. The patroness of the weavers had a question that had been bothering her for a long time. The regressor's craving for money worried and confused her, giving rise to many guesses. Therefore, Vega believed that Elizabeth, as an ancient friend, should know the true reasons for this passion. And it was indeed so. According to the owner of the house, Clyde planned to get to heaven. This name was not meant to be taken literally. This was the name given to a separate zone, separated from the mainland, without monsters and dungeons, a piece of the country of the past. While living there, one had to pay a fee, after which one could forget the suffering forever. The leader of the Guild of the Favorites of Heaven, Edgar, a follower of the constellation Ursa Major, owned this place. In general, it was believed that it was simply impossible to find a safe place in the country. Clyde had one special dream since childhood, which to many might seem meaningless and absurd. Even in the shelter, he wanted to live without fear for his safety. He wanted the feeling of hunger and cold to leave his memory forever and never return. It seemed like every child's life had these things at a basic level. But fate turned out to be cruel for the boy and girl, who did not believe that they would be better than life. The words of the interlocutor touched the heart of the goddess. She did not even suspect the suffering of the apostle. Elizabeth remembered how they were tormented by the shelter director as children. The man mercilessly beat the girl first, and she became his favorite punching bag. But after Clyde stood up for her, everything changed. The boy lied about the fire in the kitchen, thereby distracting the sadist. But when the lie was exposed, both children suffered with double cruelty. From that moment on, The stupid adult's entire attention was focused solely on punishing the swindler. This is how this naive childhood dream of safety was born. If they don't have to lie to survive, orphans will finally taste true happiness. But the thing is that only a guy can get into heaven. Once he collects the required amount of money, Elizabeth will be left alone. And it wasn't about money at all. The goddess did not understand that the girl simply could not move there with him. Permission to enter and payment of the required amount were not the deciding factors for her. In order for the locals to accept a newcomer, the latter must pass a series of tests and trials. Without legs and without sight, this did not seem possible, so Elizabeth would remain here alone. She didn't blame anyone for this. 5 years ago, the girl was a 7-star awakened one. But one incident changed her life radically. It was a fight with Barbados, the dragon of 1,000 curses during which the heroine received her own. Now she was not only physically crippled, but also cut off from her lies. That's why she and Clyde started living together 5 years ago. Elizabeth considered this to be a harsh manipulation on her part. She put forward a mandatory condition for the children to gain the right to live in paradise. Before that happens, the heavenly demon must remain to live with her. My friend explained this as a way to pay off debts to her after years of leaving. Only the accumulated billion stood between Clyde's dream and life with the crippled Elizabeth. The young man could not refuse his elder, and so a consensus was reached. Now, when years have passed, the girl would hardly have done the same. She considered it cruel. At the time of this agreement, the guy had no abilities, and a billion seemed like a cosmic sum. Therefore, this trick was supposed to keep her comrade near her for many years, perhaps until the end of his life. During the crisis, Elizabeth could not even admit that she needed support. Now that Clyde has received the stigma of the liar, everything has changed dramatically. Their time together passed like sand through their fingers, and the girl considered it karma for her cruelty. The story continued, and Elizabeth managed to get ready and received a prosthesis, which she had not used for a long time. She decided to take the first step towards independent living today. As she was leaving, she asked the goddess to look after her precious comrade. The request was received with great respect. Vega understood that all she could do was wish her interlocutor success. 20 minutes later, Elizabeth was already walking down the street. Despite the long break without practice, the girl managed to do this surprisingly well. Of course, there were some incidents, but that couldn't stop her from going astray. Not much time passed, and the heroine finally reached her destination. Her goal was to withdraw money from her bank account. All that was accumulated in 5 years with interest amounted to about 322 million. Of course, Elizabeth aspired to more, but she understood that she was not in a fairy tale. This amount, in all likelihood, is absolutely not enough to buy the dragon's eye. Despite the circumstances, the heroine still insisted on withdrawing the entire amount from the deposit account. Life after the shelter did not spoil the girl either. With the opening of the portals, she simply fought for existence. There was no talk of earning money. It was only 2 years later that we managed to start saving. But when the irreparable happened, the lion's share of the money went to cover medical bills. Now all that was left was to work with what had been saved. Years of wandering have ingrained within Elizabeth the mantra of never giving up. While the last hope was still glimmering in the middle, the girl was ready to fight. Under the house, the heroine felt the presence of a comrade. The smell of his protein bars was unmistakable. But this time there was no warm meeting in the usual format. Clyde started screaming almost immediately. It turned out that the young man was incredibly worried about the absence of his girlfriend. This reaction left Elizabeth stumped. It was the first time she had heard anything like a comrade. The girl decided to switch to a humorous note and pretended that she had no idea about such feelings. She didn't want to argue anymore, and the heavenly demon had to accept these conditions. After a short pause, the eldest decided that they needed to go somewhere. She wasn't going to reveal all her cards right away, so Clyde had no choice but to trust. The first location to visit was a shopping center. Here, Elizabeth asked the consultants at one of the stores to pick up some meadows for a friend. Although he was very indignant about this, his desires were not important. The young man saved every penny first of all, denying himself even the necessary things. And I didn't understand at all what had come over my friend and why she was behaving so impractically. But the answer was one. The guy didn't have to worry about anything and didn't have to pay either. The heroine justified the purchase of the things by the fact that Clyde always wears the same worn-out outfit. Elizabeth said that she withdrew money from her account and wanted to please her friend. The mall wasn't the only place the girl wanted to visit today. It was time to eat. For dinner, she suggested eating beef, the most expensive meat in Korea. Clyde's persuasions and objections were again ignored. The couple stopped at the door of the restaurant the guy had chosen. Elizabeth was about to go into the middle when, Unexpectedly, she smelled the aroma of seafood. It turned out to be so tempting and delicious that she asked Clyde about the name of the establishment. They were cooking crabs there, and this offer, at the last moment, turned out to be more desirable than beef. Despite the fact that the heroine herself couldn't stand this meat, the dishes in this establishment really looked very attractive. But there were still problems with eating them. Because of her blindness, Elizabeth was quite awkward. As always, the heavenly demon came to the rescue. She did not consider eating from his hands to be a humiliating task at all. All that was left for the two of them to do was to completely relax and enjoy every second. The next destination, by mutual agreement, was to be a cafe. But a surprise awaited the guy on the street. Two girls recognized him from a photo posted on the internet. They were delighted with such an unexpected meeting and immediately began to shower the hero with compliments. Clyde didn't think it was a good idea to engage his fan base, especially now. He honestly told his interlocutors about this and they fell silent in shock. But a second later they burst into a cheerful and loud hubbub again. Now they were demanding the young man's autograph as if he were a real star. The heavenly demon, feeling genuine pressure, even picked up a marker. But Elizabeth's stern voice from behind stopped this chaos. She pounced on the girls like a fury, accusing them of tactlessness. And they began to cling to each other in fear, seeking support. Clyde's girlfriend declared herself a girl and closed all questions with one word. A prolonged silence ensued. The girls showed up first, feeling very uncomfortable in the presence of this harpy. The girlfriends ran away, never admitting their impudence and wrongness. And the comrades were finally left alone and could continue the pleasant evening. Elizabeth found it funny what happened to them. But I decided to talk about something personal, and it turned out that Clyde wasn't interested in girls. And this was not because of the position, but simply because of a lack of funds for extraneous expenses. After the cafe, the friends visited a karaoke bar. There you could really forget about shyness and indulge in your musical preferences. A smile appeared on the sky demon's face for the first time that day. When they left the establishment, it was already night outside. Time flew by so quickly that no one noticed. The boy and girl walked slowly home along the well-lit streets. They walked in silence, although the girl was constantly tempted to talk about the future. She wanted to know when their cohabitation would end. Unable to resist, she asked about the money. But Clyde was reluctant to share such personal information, although he did confirm that he had saved up. From this answer, Elizabeth concluded that her comrade had the billion in his pocket. This news undermined her good mood. The departure of a dear person to heaven brought only sadness to his heart. The heroine held back her tears. An entire era was ending, years of friendship and happiness in a turbulent world. She wanted to scream for Clyde to stay, but the girl did not dare to ruin his life with her desires again. I had to pull myself together and cope with the work on my own. After a few minutes, Elizabeth looked up and smiled. All she asked of her friend was that he would not forget about her in heaven. Clyde only gritted his teeth harder in response. He did not understand the reasons for these conversations, and especially the assumption about well-being amnesia. The next morning, having announced that he was going to the bank, the young man left home. Elizabeth was now free to turn her attention to the auction collection. She was never able to tell Clyde about her plans for the Dragon's Eye. This relic removed any curses and perhaps could handle her case. Believing this helped the girl get out of bed every day. Although her cash cushion would likely be small, she had to go there. Thoughts about a possible miracle were still swarming in the heroine's head. It was terrible to live in a world without dreams. If everything works out, she will be able to reach heaven and follow her friend. Filled with determination, Elizabeth rose from her bed. The taxi took the girl to the auction building. The organizer greeted her politely and with great respect, and when he saw that the visitor had vision problems, he suggested that she fill out the form herself. After some time, the heroine finally received permission to go inside. Of course, not impartial help because of his flaw. She heard everyone talking about blindness and disability, but she kept moving forward. She had to endure everything to get what she wanted. The auctioneer announced the start of the event. At first, simpler lots were put up for auction, which still had extremely high starting prices. Judging by the reviews, there were a lot of people who wanted to buy it. In the end, the first trinket went to a buyer for almost 700 million. This was a sum that was twice the budget that Elizabeth had at her disposal. The girl still convinced herself that this item was extremely popular. But almost the same thing happened with the following lots. Finally, it was the Dragon's Eye's turn, and the auctioneer happily ordered the item to be rolled out for inspection. This was an event even for him, which the man immediately noted. A sacred relic that could remove any curse was made available for auction. The girl listened intently to everything the manager said. She prepared for battle. It seemed to her that there were no other people around who were so interested in purchasing this lot. Perhaps there was still a chance of victory, the smallest, but so desirable. The auctioneer announced a starting bid of 100 million and a maximum bid of 10 billion. Elizabeth was the first to raise her number, repeating the sum of 100 million. The assembled people looked at her in surprise. At first there was silence in the hall, but it was replaced by caustic laughter and disgusting comments. The girl heard all sorts of things addressed to her, and blushing with shame, she continued to hold the sign. The bet was accepted, and at first no one made any proposals. Elizabeth clenched her teeth even tighter. She prayed that the eye would be hers. But the next bet destroyed the last hopes. Someone offered 2 billion, after which the fight was carried out on a completely new level, to which the girl had no access. It awakened a disappointed laughter somewhere deep in my soul. What hope could one have for such possibilities? But the next second, tears began to flow from her eyes. She felt betrayed by her own convictions. Since childhood, Elizabeth knew only betrayal and beatings. But on the good side, she had only light inside. For the first time in her life one day, she hoped that life would give her a happy moment. Was it really that much she was asking for? Just the opportunity to always be close to Clyde? Bursting into tears, the girl did not immediately notice that someone was sitting next to her. After the man spoke up, she began to wipe away her tears as if in a fever. The stranger introduced himself as Gary. He was a member of the Star Lake Guild. In a soft, trustworthy voice, the interlocutor promised to lend Elizabeth 6 billion. But he asked for much more, showing this by placing his hand on the blind woman's thigh. He wanted to buy the girl for a period of 5 years for the specified amount. The pervert insisted that this was a completely normal thing, and that he didn't need much. Just each other's company and intimacy on demand. He continued to tell his vision of the future, which literally made the woman sick. Elizabeth hadn't met such crazy people for a long time. Just as she was able to pull herself together enough to refuse the scoundrel, something happened. The exit door to the hall opened wide, and the silhouette of a guy appeared in the opening. The security guard tried to stop the new arrival because it was against the auction rules. But he silently responded by showing the appearance of an association special agent. When all obstacles were overcome, nothing separated the stranger from his goal. Potential buyers, one and all, looked back at the eccentric, and Elizabeth froze in place because she heard painfully familiar steps. After apologizing for the sudden performance, the auctioneer attempted to continue the bidding. But 2 suitcases in the hands of the new arrival prevented this from happening. They flew towards the stands. Opening up in the air, there was a lot of money there. Some of the bills flew into the air in front of the astonished spectators. Clyde shouted loudly that he was offering 10 billion in cash for the dragon's eye. Thus, the most precious relic of that day was bought at the highest price that could not be beaten. The auctioneer closed the bidding by announcing the winner. Meanwhile, the heavenly demon simply walked up to the podium and took his purchase. Elizabeth's heart sank. She expected anything but this development of events. A lot of questions swarmed in the girl's head, weathered immediately after the comrade came close to her. The first thing Clyde saw was the stranger's hand on his friend's knee. The guy clearly and briefly ordered the scoundrel to leave. But he didn't understand the first time, so I had to explain it in more detail. The pervert's hand immediately went up, but he couldn't allow the stranger to treat him like that. Jumping from his spot, Gary tried to impress his opponent with his membership in the Star Lake Guild. His brain could not comprehend the information about the special agent. Suddenly, the guy's face matched the memories of recent events. It was the same hero savior, the lightning-fast wolf. Competing with him could cost one's life. A Lyra constellation apostle of this level exuded power without even opening his mouth. But when it happened, Gary immediately began to apologize for his behavior. To enhance the effect, Clyde suggested talking directly to the head of the Star Lake Guild. The pervert's legs gave way under him from what he heard. Falling to his knees, he continued to beg for mercy and to forget about what had happened, to which the swindler readily agreed, although he became incredibly furious. His only desire now was to be alone with Elizabeth. Realizing this, Gary hurried out of the auction room without looking back. The girl didn't know what to do with herself. She didn't want conflicts or uncomfortable situations. Luckily, her friend's hand touched her palm. The bearer of the Lyre constellation led his friend out of the hall in complete silence, under the close observation of hundreds of people. After some time, they found themselves on the roof of the auction house building. Now it was possible to speak freely. Elizabeth wanted to know the reasons why the guy traded a ticket to heaven for a dragon's eye. She was sure that the young man had spent all his savings, a gigantic sum. Instead of answering, Clyde asked his friend to stand still. He brought the sacred relic to the girl's head, expecting a miracle. And indeed, within a few seconds, the curse she had lived with for 5 years began to lose its power. Of course, it didn't happen painlessly, but Clyde willingly offered his shoulder to ease his friend's worries. A minute later, for the first time in many years, she opened her eyes and saw. I saw everything. My friend's face, the nature around me, and the stars in the sky. The swindler smiled slyly. He got what he wanted more than anything else, the girl's health. The road home was very long today. Elizabeth admired the smallest details. I noticed the smallest stars and was mesmerized by the beauty of the world around me, holding my breath. This gift touched her heart so deeply that she was unable to hold back her tears. But the day of surprises is not over yet. The chest that Ben gave to the young man yesterday was also intended for Elizabeth. It had a new prosthesis, much better and more ergonomic than the previous one. Now the guy could be calm about the girl's fate. He was able to thank her in the best possible way. Elizabeth didn't know how to cope with the feelings that were tearing her apart inside. No one had ever done anything like that in her life, and that was a miracle. So instead of simply expressing gratitude, she attacked her friend for not making his dream come true. The girl remembered every conversation about the future that they had discussed recently. It was always about heaven, not about her sight or the curse. The guy never once contradicted his desire to live a happy life. Elizabeth, in her mind, had been living out her farewell to her comrade almost every day for the last month. But judging by Clyde's face, he had been planning to do this for a long time. All this time, and it took him a lot of effort to keep everything a secret. Now, at this moment, it became obvious to the girl that her friend had been saving her throughout her life. He never left her in trouble, always supported her, and was there. Even when the girl didn't notice it, he sacrificed himself for her. The guy never complained and always radiated confidence and kindness. Today, he stood before her just as he had many years ago, smiling and informing her that he had lied. This was the beginning of Elizabeth's exciting life, full of mistakes and fun. She tried to cook for the first time and it didn't turn out very well. Clyde had to remind her how to use the stove. Dinner was hopelessly ruined, but this time together allowed them to have a lot of fun. This happened because the heroine tried to use her own stigma. She wanted to increase the fire a little. The guy understood that this process would not be quick. It would take time to develop. The main thing is that the girl felt good and was healthy. In fact, the right eye affected by the relic saw much better than the left one, and this was unusual. But it wasn't some kind of side effect, quite the opposite. This is what the Dragon Eye blessing looked like. Vega reported that in addition to cleansing from a curse, this thing could interact with the stigma of the owner. Now the girl was faced with an exciting study of managing her own new capabilities. Little was known about the dragon's stigma other than it was very powerful. There were only 20 such people in the world, and Elizabeth became one of them. In the end, the heroine promised to progress in studying her own abilities slowly. First of all, she wanted to recover physically and compensate for the costs she had incurred, hinting at cooking, which almost made the guy lose consciousness. Indeed, Clyde was more pleased with his decision than ever. He liked to see his friend happy. Lately, he had often been tormented by one question that had no answer. Why was he left alone in his past life? Where did Elizabeth go? Could this horror of destroying the world really be connected to this? It was possible to go so crazy as to bring humanity to its death. But pressing issues required urgent solutions. The goddess was bored without work. She wanted the young man to go on a mission, and he already had some idea about it. But it took a little help to do this. The goddess, without hearing a word of details, immediately agreed to do everything that depended on her. The first thing the guy did after the conversation was call Ben and ask for a vacation. He needed 3 whole months to resolve his own pressing issues, but this caused problems. In fact, it was the attention from those around him after killing the monster that prompted the guy to go into hiding. Having explained his point of view, he finally found understanding in the person of the head of the guild. The ideal training location had to guarantee absolute isolation. The goddess provided her own sanctuary at the request of the only apostle of the lyre. When all the details were agreed upon, he went there. The question arose as to how training should be conducted. The young man never liked to learn theory, so he insisted on practice. But sparring with a goddess was not an acceptable option, and this woman spoke first. The naive swindler believed that he could match him in strength. But even if it is held at the maximum level, there will still be a high risk of the apostle being destroyed. But there was another option. Vega had an assistant endowed with a part of the divine soul. A second later, she had already summoned her faithful servant Dylan. The wolf appeared a moment later. He looked sternly in the direction of the stranger. The beast decided that someone had broken into the sanctuary that needed to be dealt with. Having recovered from his state of shock, Clyde very quickly got his bearings. He greeted the wolf joyfully, as if they had known each other for 1,000 years. In response, the furry demigod looked intently at the guy again. Vega explained that this was the savior of the world, a regressor who needed a favor. There was a need to hold a training match. At the goddess's command, the wolf took on a more convenient form for this. Having activated the stigma, the demigod was ready for the first attack. Clyde prepared to defend himself, relying on his endurance. He thought he could handle at least one skirmish, but the enemy's first blow knocked him off his feet and threw him into the far corner of the sanctuary hall. It was a total failure. The guy didn't even have time to react. He simply didn't see his opponent's movements. The wolf stood in front of him, smiling predatorily. He did not believe that this man saved the world. The first negative experience only encouraged Clyde to take even more active control of his own abilities. 2 months flew by like one day in constant training and sparring. But the guy never managed to defeat Dylan. In general, the demigod considered the young man's attempts to be completely pointless. The regressor was weak. Any attempts to contract or escape were stopped. And most importantly, there was no chance to rest, although the person needed to restore his strength. Dylan was of the opinion that in a real fight no one gives breaks. Therefore, the opponent had to receive a blow, even if he was unbearably tired. Eventually, this regime resulted in Clyde having no living place on his body. Moreover, during his entire stay in the sanctuary, he was unable to hold out for more than a minute. This was a bit puzzling and suggested a lack of progress. Something needed to change, and a sudden decision came from nowhere. Clyde suggested that instead of regular sparring, they fight for real. The fraudster believed that the issue was in the understanding of his own complete safety. Dylan was not against it in general, but he believed that such events should be held in the goddess's sanctuary. It was in this room that Vega could control the laws of physics and bring the dead back to life. The goddess, hearing that the two assistants had decided to move to a new level, hastened to react. She was completely against reckless actions because she was afraid for the apostle. The fact is that the painful death that a person experiences remains with him forever, and this, in the long run, could lead to madness. Clyde remained deaf to all objections and continued to ask the goddess for a favor. The guy insisted that he had no doubts about his choice. And finally, the patroness of the Weavers agreed to take a dangerous step. A divine sanctuary formed around the arena within a few seconds. While the trial was going on, the demigod watched his opponent. The wolf could not believe that a gentle, weak boy could prevent a catastrophe and save the life of a goddess. He felt some kind of incomprehensible catch in this situation, and Dylan was used to trusting his feelings. When everything was ready, the beast released the desire to kill. He no longer held back. The negative emotions almost knocked Clyde off his feet. He did not expect such strength. The thirst for blood filled the sanctuary and must have frightened the heavenly demon. The demigod finally showed his true strength, which left everyone breathless. But to the great surprise of the guy himself, this transformation had the opposite effect on the psyche. He wanted to taste mortal danger and was nervous that Dylan wouldn't attack. Tired of waiting, the regressor decided to attack first. Approaching the enemy, he used his spear on him. The movements were precise and deliberate, and the high speed made the wolf uncomfortable. The demigod thought that this was a normal attack, and in their case, completely meaningless. But at some point, the guy's spear hit the floor at the enemy's feet. Pushing off the ground, the sky demon leapt upward, maneuvering into an advantageous position. It was best to use lightning skills from above. The wolf barely managed to escape injury. With a lightning-fast movement, Dylan counterattacked and threw the guy away from him. Clyde fell to the ground with great force. Opening his eyes, the young man saw the majestic figure of a demigod above him. With one blow of his hand, he pierced the chest of the heavenly demon. The goddess's scream was frantic. She did not expect that the guy would meet such a quick end. With his last breath, the swindler seemed to have freed himself from some kind of shackles. He saw Vega come to him and begin the healing process. The regressor came to his senses after just a few minutes, full of strength for new achievements. The body treacherously ached in the city from a fatal wound. Dylan thought that this would be the end of the dangerous experiment due to the fear of death. But after his remark, Clyde instantly grabbed his spear and ran to attack, after which he died again, and then some more. Each subsequent attempt ended in the same thing: fatal injuries to the person. Attempts to use the lightning skill in response were met only with laughter. The demigod noticed that at this rate the young man would not even leave a scratch on him. This gave the regressor the idea that he needed to come up with new tricks. Since it has absorbed some powers from other stigmas, a combination can be tried. The first thing that came to mind was to combine the stigma of the lyre and the stigma of the owl. This decision fulfilled the fourth condition for enlightening the dark skies, whatever that meant. Clyde obtained the maximum level Lightning Wings mix skill and used it. The unexpected change in battle tactics confused the demigod. Taking the hit with his body, Dylan couldn't believe that the guy had such capabilities hidden within himself. The recently awakened Regressor was already capable of developing mixed combat techniques. After a few seconds of confusion, the wolf became enraged and felt cheated. With a kick, he threw his opponent several meters away from himself. Still shouting loudly, Dylan began to approach the boy with vengeance in his heart. He took Clyde's abilities and Vega's attention to him as a personal insult, and only the voice of the goddess was able to stop the next bloodshed. The patroness of the Weavers shielded the apostle with her body, preventing the demigod from committing the massacre. She understood Dylan's feelings of jealousy and concern about his fate. Before the Regressor appeared, the demigod was Vega's only ward and was not used to sharing her with anyone. But now the wolf was showing an unacceptable part of his nature, which the goddess was not going to put up with. Seeing the seriousness of the consequences for himself, the beast immediately began to ask for forgiveness. The battle should have ended here. The goddess was only waiting for the victim to awaken. To her surprise, it happened much faster than Vega expected. Moreover, Clyde's desire to test his fate never disappeared. He proposed a new round, like a suicide who wanted to end his miserable life. The swindler's face was lit up with a joyful smile. The guy couldn't understand why he was being refused. The demigod said nothing this time, taking a safer position of silence. This behavior seemed strange, and at one point the young man even thought that Dylan was afraid. But it was not quite so. The beast was rather embarrassed, and there was a reason for this. The wolf saw very strange behavior in front of him. After such kicks, it was impossible to stand on his feet. The Regressor did this, thirsted for more, and radiated an aura of complete madness. The boy's eyes shone with a capricious radiance, one that sent shivers down one's spine. Everything finally stopped when Vega firmly gave the young man the order to stop. She no longer wanted such a practice in her sanctuary because the two knew no boundaries. Now Clyde had to apologize too, and in addition, promised to be much more careful with your life. After a peculiar gesture of a childish oath, the apology was accepted. Dylan watched this scene from the sidelines and was left with an impression that he preferred to keep to himself. Changing his fighting strategy on the fly and his talent for mixing techniques truly amazed the warrior. But all this surpassed the ability to overcome the fear of death. Usually this process looked like a full-fledged path of psychotherapy and did not last a few seconds. And this guy turned out to be capable of things that were beyond belief. Despite his unconditional eccentricity, Clyde was still able to convince his opponent of his superiority. But he didn't even suspect this, because he wasn't busy trying to appease the goddess. The swindler could not come up with anything better than the usual flattery. When 3 months had passed, the boy knocked on Ben's office door. With his trademark smile, he greeted his husband as if they had seen each other yesterday. It turned out that during the absence of the owner of the office, he was promoted to the chief administrator of the association. Since this was good news, both interlocutors decided to celebrate it over dinner. Ben volunteered to pay, so a place that served tasty meat was chosen. Clyde couldn't pass up the opportunity to eat for free and ordered the entire menu. During his absence, the guy really missed the unrivaled national cuisine. He said that 3 months allowed him to reach the 4th star. This news shocked Ben, because Lyra was considered a very difficult constellation to level up. Regressed attributed everything to his diligence and persistence due to the attention of those around him. After talking about his own life, the guy was interested in hearing what was happening in the world at that time. As it turned out, things were not going well. A monster breakthrough occurred in the city through a new portal. These were not ordinary monsters, but special mutants. There were so many of them that people gave names to the most common varieties. The freaks occupied an entire densely populated area and forced the residents to evacuate. The area was literally teeming with mutants. There were more than 1,000 of them, so a squad of exterminators was created. They received a good salary for clearing and could sell all the artifacts they received in the process. The hero liked this way of spending time. He could fully immerse himself in the adventures. So, without further ado, I asked for permission to join this work. Ben readily agreed and said that another raid was planned in 2 days. Clyde was fully satisfied with the conditions, during which time he was able to enjoy Elizabeth's company. When the smallest nuances were discussed and her meal was eaten, it was late evening. It was time to return home, but the usual meeting with the girl in the apartment did not take place. The awakened one was on the roof of the house and was training her stigma. During Clyde's absence, the friend managed to significantly improve her abilities. She enjoyed the opportunity to do what she loved again. The guy could watch an amazing performance. Fire, like a living creature, danced in the air. Until this point, the heavenly demon perceived Elizabeth's power as a spectator from an aesthetic point of view. But now, as an awakened one, I finally understood the full power of my friend. At the most interesting moment, the girl noticed the arrival of the observer and stopped, joyfully greeting him. Feeling a little ashamed, Elizabeth began to justify what she considered to be her small progress. Clyde didn't think so and immediately changed the subject to health, because he saw that she was wearing an eye patch. It turned out that there was no deterioration. The interlocutor did this out of convenience. When the euphoria of a long separation ended, domestic quarrels about food began. The situation was only corrected when he told us about the tasks. Of course, Elizabeth had heard about the monster invasion in one of the city's districts. But I couldn't even imagine that my comrade, immediately upon arrival, would disappear again for several days. The sadness in his interlocutor's eyes confused the young man a little. But after a few seconds, she announced that she wanted to join him. 2 days later, for the first time in their lives, the friends went to work together. All they saw around them were ruins and a fiery hell. There shouldn't have been any civilians in this area today. The freaks have reached the center. But to their great surprise, the boy and girl saw a crowd ahead. It turned out that reporters were not affected by the evacuation if a sensation was at stake. The heroes who agreed to take part in the cleanup of the area were happy to provide interviews to anyone who wanted to. But with the appearance of the lightning wolf, all the attention of the information jackals turned to him. Journalists bombarded the guy with questions that he had no desire to answer. But this didn't make the attention any less. The scammer had to turn on the discontent and remind about the inappropriateness of being in the civilian zone. Dispersing the vultures with his hands, he walked straight through the crowd with Elizabeth. Such actions were received with admiration, and a few words that the young man said have already been published. The administrator announced that all heroes had to split into threes to carry out the cleanup. So the friends got a little stuck. They were missing one person. Fortunately, the problem resolved itself. One of the awakened ones recognized Clyde and suggested joining a group. The guy's name was Gregory. He had the Taurus stigma and was a member of the Valhalla Guild. The heavenly demon remembered that he had seen the young man on business at the observatory. He had good skills. The agreement was made. It was time to get to know each other better and exchange news. It turned out that Kenneth was busy looking for new clues about the organization of the Dark Stars. These scoundrels were very good at covering their tracks and hiding the main leader, Edwin. Since Elizabeth didn't know who they were talking about, she decided to interrupt the conversation and introduce herself. The new acquaintances shook hands and were about to leave, but something unpredictable happened. A tall blonde man with an unpleasant character and claims against Clyde approached them. It was the same visitor to the VIP room of the Association Bank whom the guy had deceived. But this information did not reach the fraudster immediately, which further outraged the victim. Of course, a lot of time has passed since then, and this insignificant event has faded from the regressor's memory. The question about exchanging greetings completely blew the roof off the interlocutor's self-control. The stream of dirty abuse was interrupted by another candidate for a hefty spanking. It was the same Gary who had sought Elizabeth at the auction. It was impossible to forget such a bastard quickly, so Clyde recognized him immediately. He was amazed by the ability of vicious people to unite into groups. Judging by the third silent companion, they all now belonged to the Imperial Scorpion Guild. What did the tattoos on different parts of the villains' bodies indicate? But if these three thought that they could shame the heavenly demon, their plan failed. Yes, the scammer did bad things to them, but not without reason, and had no remorse about it. Two arrogant scumbags were kicked out of their guilds for breaking the rules, which is their own fault. Gary thought the changes were for the better, but no one was going to convince him otherwise. And still, for what Clyde did to them, the boys promised to take revenge on him. They hinted that it was in this area that their insidious plan would be carried out today. But Clyde was only amused by this. He had no intention of being afraid of some incomprehensible upstarts. The circumstances under which the heroes gathered here contributed to the unnoticed murder and absorption of the necessary forces. One of the scoundrels had the stigma of the hounds, and the other Aquarius had what the young man needed. Eliminating such characters in the surrounding chaos became one of the fraudster's goals. He didn't even take into account the presence of his comrades, because he was sure that he would do it unnoticed. The trio encountered the first monster very quickly. The mutant turned out to be very fast, although not very powerful. Thanks to successful joint efforts, it was possible to more or less pin it down for attack. Clyde was supposed to deliver the finishing blow. Once the first freak was dealt with, New candidates for destruction appeared. The creatures changed their trajectory in order to attack people. Elizabeth did not want to be left out and actively won her right to the first trophy. With a snap of her fingers, she activated her stigma. A fiery whirlwind engulfed the mutant, who began to scream frantically in pain, unable to free himself. Although each of the destroyed creatures had at least a sixth star, they were still easy prey. Suddenly, the heavenly demon noticed that something strange was happening around him. Although the cleanup took place without any incidents, there were still some unclear things. All the monsters they had encountered so far were heading in the same direction. It felt like a trap, and in the heat of battle one could seriously risk one's own safety. A cry of pain distracted the partners from observing and discussing their next steps. Someone needed help, and Clyde, without a second's hesitation, rushed in that direction. In fact, the swindler was sure whose voice he heard, which is why he was in a hurry. And indeed, the blonde man from the VIP room was lying on the ground. He was seriously wounded and bleeding. The regressor ran up to him first and began to assess the extent of the damage. He also saw that Elizabeth and Gregory were almost there, so he had to act quickly. Brian could no longer be helped by healing potions, and that was obvious. All the time, the blonde tried to tell something, but did not have the strength to achieve his goal. When his comrades reached Clyde, the victim breathed his last. The Sky Demon was slightly annoyed that he didn't learn any useful details, but he could still take advantage of the power of absorption. As if as a sign of respect, the guy closed the dead man's eyes so as not to arouse suspicion. And at the same time, he took away his scorpion stigma. The rogue now had access to new skills to control poisons and increase agility. The comrades did not notice any changes because the dark skies were operating under the cover of a protective barrier. Once the job was done, it was time to set out in search of new adventures. The new praying mantis-like monsters turned out to be not much stronger than their predecessors. Most continued to run towards the center of the area, but a small group was still distracted. Puzzled by this behavior, the heroes decided to leave one creature alive. They wanted to follow the mutant to his final destination. The group of fighters quickly advanced through the destroyed streets. Soon, the mantis joined a whole bunch of similar ones. But, as he had not paid attention to his pursuers until now, and he was not the only one, many monsters fled to the center of the area, despite the lack of cover and the possibility of death. As in the beginning, Clyde only became more convinced that the fighters were being lured into a trap. It was strange, but maybe that's why Brian was killed. The Sky Demon decided to stop watching, despite Gregory's resistance. Although the freaks were not distinguished by strategic thinking, such a probability was not zero. Of course, the logical step would be to simply turn around and leave. But Clyde just wanted, to get to Gary and the Aquarian stigma. So he suggested that his partners inform the other hunters of what they had learned. He himself volunteered to investigate what was happening in the center of the district. In case of danger, the guy promised Elizabeth to hide immediately. Having set off in search of Gary, Clyde was already savoring his victory and new achievements. Meanwhile, the one the swindler so passionately wanted to destroy was in the center of the area. He was surrounded by monsters on all sides, but they did not want him dead. Rather, they listened to the object that the bastard was holding in his hand. In fact, the Scorpion Guild was not his trump card, unlike the Dark Star Alliance. It was this order that entrusted him with an important mission. He was supposed to sow chaos and panic, to carry out a controlled invasion according to a prearranged scenario. But most importantly, Gary had a chance to take revenge on Clyde for the shame. He expected his own humiliation to be drowned out by the sounds of the liar stigma-bearer's cries of pain. It was for this very reason, as bait, that the scoundrel killed Brian. The guy didn't even realize that the heavenly demon was already watching him from the roof of one of the buildings. The scammer was in no hurry to attack him because he wanted to assess the situation before taking action. However, the current member of the Scorpion Guild had a higher cultivation rank than the guy. To gain some support, the young man decided to turn to the goddess. But she showed up at the first call and was informed about the person who needed to be gotten rid of. Clyde described Gary as a predatory rapist who destroyed the lives of hundreds of girls. Vega listened thoughtfully to the apostle's story, but continued to doubt the accuracy of the assessment. The woman could not understand why the scoundrel should be punished for something he had not yet done. The fraudster went to his antagonist to get confirmation of his words. He didn't know how to make the bastard confess to something he didn't do, but he decided to improvise. Nothing could escape the goddess's watchful eye, so doubts had to be cast aside. In a stern voice, Clyde loudly demanded that Gary confess the terrible secret out loud. He said this in such a tone that his opponent immediately thought of his own exposure. The scoundrel could not understand where and how the information leaked. The heavenly demon did not expect such behavior in response to his words. It was obvious that the interlocutor did not mean violence against the girls, so there was something else hidden behind the fear. Suddenly, Gary's expression changed from shock to confident insolence. He wanted revenge and fury, and finally he could not restrain it because the enemy was standing opposite. Stretching his hand with the crystal upward, the scoundrel announced the punishment in the name of the dark stars. The monsters immediately obeyed the order of their master and began to fly in response to the call. The guy no longer hid his membership in the sect, although he did not understand how they found out about him. Clyde assessed the situation and realized that a fight was inevitable. Even though the guy saw with his own eyes the first time a person controlled mutants, the main thing was to reflect, and for this the blessing of Vega, who was nearby, was required. The goddess suddenly asked for forgiveness for her suspicious behavior towards the apostle. She no longer had any doubts and fulfilled the young man's request with interest. The guy experienced a very strong surge of energy. It felt like the goddess had never influenced his power like that before. Now all that was left was to do the lesser thing: destroy the monsters that wanted him dead. Having activated the stigma, he eliminated the one who was closest within a second. Others, who were more fortunate, stopped in amazement for the first time in their lives. The guy had no intention of ending his attack. He was confident in his superiority. And not in vain, because with one lightning bolt he destroyed the entire swarm. During 3 months of training, he learned to create discharges directly from the air. But the praying mantises did not come on their own. Suddenly the earth began to bustle and collapsed under the hero's feet. He managed to jump back, which kept his limbs intact. From there, a monster appeared, resembling a predatory flower with a long, slobbering tongue. The monsters seemed to be pleased with the addition to their ranks. But the heavenly demon had no intention of giving up his position. He activated the bracelets and pointed them at his opponents. Anyone touched by the cable faced a painful death from the next activation of the stigma. With the last mutant falling to the ground lifeless, it's time to deal with the guy who was leading them. Judging by the reaction of Gary and the other member of his group, they were not prepared for this kind of life. The villain shook the crystal fiercely, demanding an even greater influx of monsters from him. He did not notice that this object was also influencing his own psyche. Even the henchman's comments had no effect on Hira. He was ready to tear apart anyone who pointed out to him the false course he had chosen. The thirst for revenge completely and entirely took over the villain's mind. He summoned hundreds of mutants to complete what their predecessors had failed to do. Clyde also noticed the dramatic changes and rapid loss of humanity in the enemy. But it was impossible to reach him while there were so many monsters running around. And it seemed almost impossible to cope with them on my own, especially since Vega's blessing opportunities were coming to an end. The goddess held on with all her strength, working to the point of exhaustion. Clyde moved at maximum speed, trying to destroy the largest number of opponents, in time, which was rapidly running out. But he would never have been able to deal with all the monsters now. We still had to work on a targeted basis and solve problems as they arose. Suddenly, one of the giant individuals appeared right in front of the guy. At the same time, Vega screamed that she was already on the edge. Death has never been so close to the swindler. If it weren't for the appearance of the fiery stigma, everything could have ended in tragedy. The fire destroyed the mutant within seconds. Startled, Clyde looked back, already realizing who he would see behind him. Elizabeth stood on the ruins of some building, and behind her, Gregory was preparing for battle. The friend was not very friendly because the regressor did not keep his promise to run away. But when she read silent gratitude for the rescue in her comrade's eyes, she calmed down a little. The girl reported that she had contacted other cleanup teams and that everyone was rushing here. Before they arrived, she needed to play a little prank, so she took off the blindfold from her eye. When the dragon relic came to light, strange things began to happen. The monsters all stopped as one, forgetting that they were supposed to attack. This was the first time Clyde had seen the power of the dragon stigma in action. A pillar of fire formed behind Elizabeth. It looked like a real flying lizard. To be honest, the awakened one herself was pleased that she would be able to use this skill for the first time.